In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a shocking murder rocks the peace when Mr. Grayson is found dead in the churchyard, his secrets buried with him. Enter Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster who sees what others miss. A stranger in a hat, a trail of clues marked R, and a hidden will spark a web of lies, Clara's fear, a butcher's temper, and whispers of stolen money. As Miss Marple unravels forgotten promises and buried debts, each twist pulls her closer to a cunning killer hiding in plain sight. Can she solve the puzzle before the village's dark past claims another life? Dive into a mystery where every clue counts. Chapter 1. The Village Whispers. The village of St. Mary Mead lay quiet under a sky streaked with pink and gold. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the thatched cottages and neat gardens. Roses bloomed in every yard, their sweet scent mixing with the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, and the distant quack of ducks by the pond carried through the evening air. It was a peaceful scene, the kind that made you think nothing bad could ever happen here. But Miss Jane Marple, sitting by her cottage window with a cup of tea, knew better. She had lived long enough to know that even the smallest villages hid secrets, dark ones that bubbled up when you least expected. Miss Marple was a tiny woman, her white hair tucked neatly under a soft cap, her blue eyes sharp as needles. Her hands worked steadily, knitting a scarf, but her mind was never still. She noticed everything, the way people walked, the things they said, the things they didn't say. To most, she was just a kind old lady who liked to gossip, but Miss Marple saw herself differently. She was a student of people, and people, she knew, were rarely what they seemed. As she sipped her tea, she felt a prickle of unease. Something was wrong in St. Mary Mead today. She couldn't name it yet, but it was there, like a storm cloud hiding just beyond the hills. The village was small, with barely 200 souls. Everyone knew each other's business, and news traveled fast. The high street was the heart of it all, lined with the bakery, the butcher's shop, and Mrs. Carter's little store that sold everything from thread to jam. At one end stood the church, its stone tower old and weathered, and at the other was the Rose and Crown Inn, where men gathered to talk and drink. Lately there had been new faces at the inn, strangers who didn't belong. Miss Marple had noticed them, and she didn't like it. Strangers brought trouble, and trouble was exactly what she sensed tonight. She set her teacup down and leaned closer to the window. The village green was alive with evening activity. Children ran near the duck pond, shouting and laughing as they played tag. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, hurried across the green with a basket of rolls, her apron dusted with flour. Mr. Hodges, the postman, pedaled his bicycle down the lane, his whistle cheerful but off-key. It all looked normal, but Miss Marple's instincts told her otherwise. Her eyes scanned the scene, searching for the source of her unease. Then she saw it, a man standing by the church gate, half hidden in the shadow of a yew tree. He was tall, wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low over his face. He wasn't from St. Mary Mead, she was certain of that. The man glanced around, his movements quick and cautious, like a fox sniffing the air. Then he slipped down the path toward the vicarage, moving so smoothly he seemed to melt into the dusk. Miss Marple's fingers paused on her knitting. "Well now," she murmured, "who might you be?" She watched until he was out of sight, her mind already turning over possibilities. Was he a visitor, a thief, or something worse? She made a mental note to keep an eye on the vicarage. Her gaze shifted back to the green. Mrs. Lucy Bell, the vicar's wife, was walking toward the church, carrying a bundle of flowers for the altar. She was a gentle woman, always organizing teas or collecting clothes for the poor, but tonight her steps were hurried, her face tight with worry. Miss Marple tilted her head. Mrs. Bell wasn't one to fuss over nothing. Something had upset her, and Miss Marple wanted to know what. The pomder clock on her mantel chimed 6, its soft ding breaking the quiet. Miss Marple stood, smoothing her skirt, and decided it was time for a walk. She pulled on her coat, a soft gray one that kept out the evening chill, and picked up her walking stick. It wasn't that she needed it, but it was useful for poking, at things like hedges where clues might hide. She stepped outside, locking her cottage door, and breathed in the cool air. The village was settling down now, with lights glowing in windows and the smell of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. She nodded to neighbors as she passed, her smile warm, but her eyes sharp. "Good evening, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Carter, from her shop door, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Fine evening, isn't it?" "Very fine," Miss Marple replied, her voice light, but she was already scanning the street, looking for anything out of place. She headed toward the church, curious about the man in the hat. The vicarage was a tidy house next to the church, its walls covered in ivy that glowed green in the fading light. As she neared, she saw Mrs. Bell standing outside, talking to a young woman Miss Marple didn't know. The woman was slim, with dark hair tied back and a pale face that looked pinched with fear. She kept glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be watching. Miss Marple slowed her steps, pretending to admire the roses by the church gate. She was close enough to hear bits of their talk. "You mustn't worry so much," Mrs. Bell was saying, her voice soft but firm. "It's probably nothing at all." "But I saw him again," the young woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Last night by the house. He was just standing there watching. I'm sure it was him." Miss Marple's ears perked up. She didn't know who him was, but the fear in the young woman's voice was real. She stored the detail away like a squirrel tucking nuts for winter. Mrs. Bell patted the woman's arm and led her inside the vicarage. Miss Marple lingered a moment, then continued her walk, her mind buzzing. A stranger watching the vicarage? That was no small thing. She turned toward the Rose and Crown Inn, where the windows glowed with warm light. Inside, men laughed and clinked glasses, their voices loud in the quiet evening. Miss Marple paused, peering through the glass. She saw Mr. Thomas, the butcher, sitting with Dr. Haydock, the village doctor. They were listening to a man she didn't recognize, a stout fellow, with a red face and a loud voice. He was waving his hands, telling a story that had the others leaning in. Miss Marple wondered who he was. A traveler passing through? A salesman? Or someone with a reason to be here? She made a note to ask Dolly Bantry about him. Dolly always knew the latest gossip. She moved on, taking the lane past the old manor house. It belonged to Colonel Bantry and his wife Dolly, who were old friends of Miss Marple's. The manor was grand, with tall windows and a wide lawn, but it was showing its age. The paint was peeling, and the roof needed work. The Bantrys weren't rich, and they'd closed off parts of the house to save money. As Miss Marple passed, she noticed a light in an upstairs window, one that should have been dark. She stopped, frowning. Why was someone up there? She added it to her list of oddities. The lane looped back to the village green, and Miss Marple found herself near the duck pond again. The children were still playing, their shouts filling the air. But one boy stood alone, staring at the water. It was Tommy, the baker's son, a quiet lad with a sharp mind. Miss Marple approached him, her stick tapping the ground. "Evening, Tommy," she said kindly. "What's so interesting in the pond?" Tommy jumped, then relaxed when he saw her. "Nothing, Miss Marple," he said quickly, but his hands fidgeted and his eyes darted away. Miss Marple smiled. Children were terrible liars. "Come now," she said. "You look like you've seen something spooky." Tommy hesitated, then leaned closer. "I did see something," he whispered. "Last night, by the pond. A man was standing there just staring at the water. He had a funny hat and he didn't move for a long time. It gave me the creeps." Miss Marple's heart beat faster, but she kept her face calm. "A man with a hat?" she asked. "Did you know him?" Tommy shook his head. "He wasn't from here. I'd have known him if he was." "Thank you, Tommy," Miss Marple said. "You're a clever boy. Keep watching, won't you?" Tommy nodded, looking proud, and ran off to join his friends. Miss Marple stood by the pond, thinking. A stranger by the church, a stranger by the pond, a nervous woman at the vicarage, and a light in the manor. The pieces didn't fit yet, but they would. They always did. As she turned toward home, the church bell rang out slow and heavy. It wasn't the usual time for bells, and Miss Marple's frown deepened. She quickened her pace, her stick tapping, faster. When she reached the high street, she saw a crowd outside the church. Mrs. Carter was there, along with Dr. Haydock and Mr. Hodges. Their faces were pale, their voices hushed. "What's happened?" Miss Marple asked, joining them. Mrs. Carter turned, her eyes wide. "It's awful, Miss Marple. They've found Mr. Grayson dead in the churchyard." Miss Marple's breath caught. Mr. Grayson was the church warden, a stern man who handled the church records and the collection plate. He wasn't loved, but he was part of the village. "Dead?" she repeated. "How did it happen?" Dr. Haydock stepped forward, his voice grim. "He was hit on the head, behind the gravestones. It's no accident, I'm afraid." The word hung in the air. Murder. Miss Marple's mind raced. She thought of the stranger by the church, the nervous woman, the light in the manor, and Tommy's story. A murder in St. Mary Mead was no small thing. It was planned, deliberate, and clever. She looked at the crowd, their faces a mix of shock and fear. "Has anyone called the police?" she asked. "They're coming," Dr. Haydock said. "Inspector Slack's on his way from Much Benham." Miss Marple nodded. Inspector Slack was good at his job, but he was impatient and missed the small things. She would have to watch closely. As the crowd whispered, she slipped away, heading back to her cottage. Her tea was cold now, but she didn't care. She sat by the window, picked up her knitting, and let her mind work. Mr. Grayson's death was no random act. Someone had wanted him gone, someone smart and careful. Miss Marple thought of the people she'd seen: Mrs. Bell, the young woman, the man, in the hat, the loud stranger at the inn. Each was a thread in the tapestry, and she would weave them together. The village was quiet now, the stars bright above, but danger was close. Miss Marple knitted on, her needles clicking, her mind sharp. A killer was hiding in St. Mary Mead, and she would find them. The evening deepened, and the village slept, but Miss Marple's eyes stayed open, watching, waiting. She knew this was only the beginning. A cunning murderer was at work, and it would take all her skill to catch them. For now, she let the quiet settle, knowing the next clue was never far away. The village of St. Mary Mead was a place of habit. Every morning the same routines unfolded. Mrs. Price opened the bakery at dawn, filling the air with the smell of warm bread. Mr. Hodges cycled through the lanes, delivering letters and gossip. The children ran to the schoolhouse, their voices loud and carefree. But this morning the air felt different. News of Mr. Grayson's death had spread, and the village was buzzing with whispers. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, a slice of toast and a fresh cup of tea before her. She didn't eat much, her mind too busy with the events of last night. She thought about Mr. Grayson. He was a tall man, with gray hair and a face that rarely smiled. As church warden, he was meticulous, keeping the church's books in perfect order. But he had a sharp tongue and a way of making enemies. Miss Marple remembered how he'd scolded Tommy for kicking a ball near the church flowers. She also recalled a heated argument between Mr. Grayson and Mr. Thomas, the butcher, over money owed for a church event. Could that be important? She wasn't sure yet, but she filed it away. Her thoughts turned to the stranger by the church. Tommy's story about the man by the pond suggested they might be the same person. A hat pulled low, a sneaky way of moving. Those were signs of someone with something to hide. And then there was the young woman at the vicarage, so frightened she could barely speak. Who was she afraid of? The same man? Or someone else? Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the questions simmer. She decided to visit Dolly Bantry. Dolly was her oldest friend in the village, and her manor house was a hub of gossip. If anyone knew about the strangers in town, it would be Dolly. Miss Marple put on her hat, a sensible one with a small flower, and stepped outside. The morning was crisp with dew sparkling on the grass. The village green was quiet now, the children already in school. She walked past the pond, where the ducks swam lazily and headed toward the manor. The manor house stood at the edge of the village, its tall windows catching the morning light. Miss Marple knocked on the door, and a maid let her in. Dolly Bantry was in the drawing room, surrounded by books and papers. She was a cheerful woman with a round face and a love for bright dresses. "Jane," she cried, standing to hug her friend. "What a dreadful thing about Mr. Grayson, have you heard?" "I was there when they found him," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "It's quite a shock." Dolly's eyes widened. "A shock? It's downright ghastly. Who would do such a thing? Poor Mr. Grayson, hit on the head like that. It's the sort of thing you read about in books, not in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple nodded, her face calm but her mind alert. "Have you noticed anything unusual lately, Dolly? Any new people in the village?" Dolly leaned forward, eager to share. "Well, there's that man at the Rose and Crown. Calls himself Mr. Baxter. Says he's here to buy antiques. But he's loud, Jane, and he asks too many questions. I don't trust him. And then there's that young woman staying at the vicarage. Lucy Bell says she's a cousin, but she doesn't look like family to me. She's jumpy, always looking around like she expects trouble." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "A cousin, you say? Did Lucy mention her name?" "Clara, I think," Dolly said. "Clara something or other. She arrived a few days ago and Lucy's been fussing over her ever since." Miss Marple stored the name away. Clara. It was a start. She chatted with Dolly for a while longer, picking up bits of gossip about the village. Mr. Thomas had been in a bad mood lately, arguing with customers. Mrs. Carter had seen a strange car parked near the church 2 nights ago, and Colonel Bantry had mentioned a letter missing from his study, though he thought he'd just misplaced it. Each detail was small, but Miss Marple knew small things could lead to big answers. She left the manor and walked back toward the village, her stick tapping the ground. The high street was busier now, with people whispering about the murder. She passed the bakery where Mrs. Price was talking to a customer. "It's a terrible thing," Mrs. Price was saying. "Mr. Grayson was a good man, even if he was strict. Who would want to hurt him?" Miss Marple didn't stop, but she listened. People always said nice things about the dead, but Mr. Grayson hadn't been a saint. He'd been prickly, quick to judge, and slow to forgive. Someone had hated him enough to kill him. The question was who. She reached the church, where a policeman stood by the gate. Inspector Slack had arrived, a short man with a brisk manner and a habit of barking orders. He was talking to Dr. Haydock, who looked tired. Miss Marple approached, her face polite but curious. "Good morning, Inspector," she said. "Any news?" Inspector Slack frowned, clearly annoyed at her presence. "Miss Marple, this is a police matter. We'll handle it." "Of course," she said sweetly. "I just wondered if you'd found anything interesting." "We're working on it," he said curtly. "Now, if you'll excuse me." He turned back to Dr. Haydock, dismissing her. Miss Marple didn't mind. She knew Inspector Slack thought she was a meddling old woman, but that was fine. She worked better in the background, watching and listening. She walked around the churchyard, keeping her distance from the gravestones where Mr. Grayson had been found. The ground was still cordoned off with tape, and a young policeman was taking notes. She couldn't see much, but she noticed a patch of trampled grass near the yew tree. It wasn't much, but it was something. She returned to her cottage, her mind full of questions. The stranger in the hat, the nervous Clara, the loud Mr. Baxter, the light in the manor, the missing letter, each was a piece of the puzzle. Mr. Grayson's death was the center, and everything else circled around it. She sat by her window picking up her knitting. The needles clicked steadily, a rhythm that helped her think. She thought of the village, its quiet lanes and hidden secrets. She thought of the people, their smiles and their lies. And she thought of the killer, clever and careful, hiding among them. The day passed slowly, the village settling into an uneasy calm. Miss Marple stayed home, but her mind was out there, piecing things together. She knew the truth was close, tucked in the small moments, the glance of an eye, the slip of a tongue. She would find it, because she always did. For now she knitted and watched, waiting for the next clue to show itself. The sun set again, and St. Mary Mead grew dark. The ducks were quiet, the children gone home, but Miss Marple's cottage glowed with a single light, and inside, her sharp mind worked on, unraveling the mystery one thread at a time. A murderer walked free tonight, but not for long. Miss Marple was on the case and she never failed. Chapter 2. A Death at Dusk. The morning after Mr. Grayson's murder dawned gray and heavy over St. Mary Mead. A thin mist hung over the village, curling around the thatched cottages and dampening the cobblestone lanes. The air smelled of wet earth and fading roses, a somber contrast to the golden evening before. The village was awake, but it was quieter than usual, as if the news of death had muffled its heartbeat. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, her tea steaming in a delicate cup, her knitting resting beside a half-eaten slice of toast. Her blue eyes, sharp as ever, stared out the window at the misty green, but her mind was far from idle. A murder had shaken St. Mary Mead, and she was already piecing together the threads of the mystery. The village was still reeling from the shock of Mr. Grayson's death. He had been found in the churchyard, his body crumpled behind a row of gravestones, his head bloodied from a single brutal blow. Dr. Haydock had confirmed it was no accident, and Inspector Slack was now poking around asking questions and barking orders. Miss Marple knew the inspector was thorough, but he was too quick to jump to conclusions. She, on the other hand, preferred to watch and wait, letting the truth reveal itself in the small things. A nervous glance, a whispered word, a footprint in the grass. She thought back to yesterday, to the stranger in the hat by the church, the frightened young woman at the vicarage, and the light in the Manor's unused wing. Then there was Tommy's story of the man by the pond, and Dolly Bantry's gossip about the loud Mr. Baxter at the Rose and Crown. Each detail was a piece of the puzzle, and Mr. Grayson's murder was the center. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the facts. Mr. Grayson had been the church warden, a man of order and routine, but also a man with enemies. His sharp tongue and strict ways had rubbed many the wrong way. Who had hated him enough to kill? She set her cup down and stood, her movements slow but deliberate. Today she would dig deeper. The village was full of secrets, and she knew how to find them, through quiet chats, careful listening, and a knack for being in the right place at the right time. She pulled on her coat and hat, picked up her walking stick, and stepped outside. The mist was cool against her face, and the village felt hushed as if holding its breath. She headed toward the high street where life was stirring despite the gloom. The bakery was open, its windows fogged with warmth. Mrs. Price stood behind the counter, her face pale as she served a customer. Miss Marple stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," she said brightly. "A loaf of your brown bread, please." Mrs. Price managed a weak smile. "Morning, Miss Marple. Terrible business about Mr. Grayson, isn't it? I can't believe it happened here." "It's dreadful," Miss Marple agreed, watching Mrs. Price closely. Her hands shook slightly as she wrapped the bread. "Did you know Mr. Grayson well?" Mrs. Price hesitated, then shook her head. "Not really. He came in for rolls sometimes, but he wasn't one for chatting. Always in a hurry, that man. And he could be sharp if you got his order wrong." She lowered her voice. "My Tommy said he saw something odd last night by the pond. A man just standing there gave him a fright." Miss Marple nodded, her face calm but her mind alert. "Tommy mentioned that to me, a man with a hat, wasn't it?" "That's right," Mrs. Price said, her eyes wide. "Tommy said he looked sneaky. Do you think it's connected to, you know?" She glanced around as if the killer might be listening. "It's hard to say," Miss Marple said gently, "but Tommy's a bright boy. He notices things." She paid for the bread and left, her mind buzzing. Tommy's story was the second mention of a stranger in a hat. Was it the same man she'd seen by the church? And what was he doing in St. Mary Mead? Her next stop was the vicarage. Mrs. Lucy Bell, the vicar's wife, was in her garden, clipping wilted flowers despite the damp. Her face was tired, her eyes red-rimmed as if she hadn't slept. Miss Marple approached, her stick tapping the path. "Good morning, Lucy," she said. "Your roses are holding up well despite the weather." Mrs. Bell looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Oh, Jane. Yes, the roses are stubborn. I'm just trying to keep busy." Her voice was strained and her hands fumbled with the shears. Miss Marple tilted her head. "It's a sad time for the village. Mr. Grayson's death must be a shock to you with him being churchwarden." Mrs. Bell nodded, her lips tight. "It's awful. He was so reliable, always at the church, checking the books or organizing things. I can't imagine who would do this." Miss Marple watched her closely. Mrs. Bell was nervous, and not just about the murder. "I saw you with a young woman yesterday," she said casually. "A relative, perhaps?" Mrs. Bell's hands froze. "Oh, yes. That's Clara, my cousin. She's staying with us for a bit. She's not used to village life." Her words came too quickly, and she looked away. Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was sharp. Clara, the nervous young woman. Dolly had mentioned her too and said she didn't seem like family. Why was Mrs. Bell so uneasy about her? "It must be nice to have company," Miss Marple said. "I'd love to meet her sometime." Mrs. Bell nodded, but her smile was forced. "Yes, of course, she's just shy." She turned back to her flowers, clearly wanting to end the conversation. Miss Marple didn't push. She said goodbye and walked toward the church where the police were still at work. The churchyard was cordoned off, and Inspector Slack was talking to a young constable near the gravestones. Miss Marple lingered by the gate, pretending to adjust her scarf. She could see the spot where Mr. Grayson had been found, a patch of grass behind a tall headstone now marked with tape. The ground was muddy from the mist, and she noticed something, a faint mark in the earth like the edge of a shoe. It wasn't much, but it was odd for a churchyard path. She stored the detail away. Inspector Slack spotted her and frowned. "Miss Marple, you're here again? This is a crime scene, you know." "I'm just passing by," she said sweetly. "Terrible business, isn't it? Have you found anything useful?" "We're handling it," he said gruffly. "No need for villagers to get involved." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. She turned away, but not before. Noting the constable picking up something small from the grass, a button perhaps. She couldn't be sure, but it was another piece to tuck away. She headed to the Rose and Crown Inn next, curious about the loud Mr. Baxter. The inn was quiet in the morning, with only a few men sipping coffee. Mr. Baxter was at a corner table, reading a newspaper. He was a big man with a red face and a loud laugh that carried across the room. Miss Marple sat nearby, ordering a cup of tea. She watched him from the corner of her eye, noting how he scanned the room every few minutes, as if expecting someone. When the barmaid brought her tea, Miss Marple struck up a chat. "That gentleman seems lively," she said, nodding toward Mr. Baxter. "A visitor, I take it?" The barmaid, a young woman named Sally, nodded. "Mr. Baxter, he calls himself. Says he's here for antiques, but he's been asking about Mr. Grayson. Wanted to know where he lived, what he did. Seemed odd, now that I think about it." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her face calm. "Odd indeed. When did he arrive?" 3 days ago, Sally said. "He's been at the inn every night, talking loud and buying drinks, for everyone. But he's cagey when you ask him questions." Miss Marple thanked Sally and sipped her tea, her mind racing. Mr. Baxter had been asking about Mr. Grayson before the murder. That was no coincidence. She finished her tea and left, her stick tapping the floor as she stepped into the misty street. Her next stop was the manor house, where Dolly Bantry was sure to have more gossip. The manor was quiet, its tall windows reflecting the gray sky. Dolly welcomed her warmly, ushering her into the drawing room. "Jane, you're out early," she said, pouring tea. "I suppose you're sleuthing already, aren't you?" Miss Marple smiled. "I'm just taking a walk, Dolly, but I do wonder about Mr. Grayson. Did he ever mention trouble with anyone?" Dolly leaned forward, her eyes bright. "Well, now that you mention it, he did have a row with Mr. Thomas, the butcher, a few weeks ago. Something about money for the church fete. Grayson accused him of shortchanging the funds, and then there's Mrs. Carter. She said Grayson was rude to her about a late delivery. He wasn't a friendly man, Jane." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the names. Mr. Thomas and Mrs. Carter both had reasons to dislike Grayson. "And what about this Mr. Baxter at the inn?" she asked. Dolly's face lit up. "Oh, he's a character. Says he's here for antiques. But Colonel Bantry thinks he's up to something. He saw him near the church 2 nights ago looking shifty. And then there's that missing letter from the Colonel's study. He swears he didn't misplace it." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A missing letter, a stranger near the church, and now a murder. The pieces were starting to connect, though the picture was still blurry. She chatted with Dolly a bit longer, then headed home, her mind full of new clues. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting in her lap. The mist was lifting now, but the village felt heavier, as if the murder had cast a shadow over every house. She thought about Mr. Grayson, his stern face and sharp words. She thought about Clara, the frightened woman at the vicarage, and Mrs. Bell's nervous lies. She thought about Mr. Baxter, asking questions about the dead man, and the shoe mark in the churchyard. And she thought about the button the constable had found, small, but possibly important. The church bell rang out slow and mournful, calling people to a special service for Mr. Grayson. Miss Marple decided to attend. The church was a good place to watch people, to see who looked guilty or scared. She put on her best hat, a black one with a small veil, and walked to the church. The pews were full, the village gathered to mourn, though some faces looked more curious than sad. Mrs. Bell sat in the front, her hands clasped tightly. Clara was beside her, her face pale and her eyes darting around. Mr. Baxter was there too, sitting near the back, his loud voice silent for once. Miss Marple took a seat near the side where she could see everyone. The vicar spoke of Mr. Grayson's service to the church, but Miss Marple barely listened. She watched the crowd, noting every glance, every fidget. Mr. Thomas, the butcher, sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Mrs. Carter dabbed her eyes, but her tears seemed forced. And Clara, poor Clara, looked like she might bolt at any moment. When the service ended, Miss Marple lingered, watching as people filed out. She saw Clara slip something into Mrs. Bell's hand. A note, perhaps? She couldn't be sure, but it was another clue. As she walked home, the village was quiet. Again, the mist gone, but the air still heavy. Miss Marple's mind was alive, sorting through the day's discoveries. Mr. Baxter's questions, the shoe mark, the button, the missing letter, Clara's fear. It all pointed to a killer who was clever and careful. But Miss Marple was clever, too. She knew the truth was hidden in the village's whispers, in the small moments that most people missed. She would find it because she always did. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. The village slept, but danger was still out there, hiding in the shadows. Miss Marple's eyes were open, her mind sharp, waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. A cunning murderer thought they were safe, but they didn't know Miss Marple. She was watching, and she was getting closer. Chapter 3. Miss Marple's arrival. The mist had cleared by the 3rd day after Mr. Grayson's murder, and St. Mary Mead sparkled under a pale morning sun. The village tried to return to its usual rhythm. Children scampered to school, the bakery's chimney puffed with the promise of fresh bread, and Mr. Hodges pedaled his bicycle, delivering letters with a grim nod instead of his usual whistle. But the shadow of death lingered, heavy as the dew on the grass. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting untouched on the table, her sharp blue eyes fixed on the village green outside her window. She hadn't been idle since the church service yesterday. Her mind was a busy loom, weaving together the threads of clues she'd gathered. The stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions, the shoe mark, the button, and the missing letter from Colonel Bantry's study. Today, she would step into the heart of the mystery, not as a bystander, but as the quiet force that would unravel it. Miss Marple knew St. Mary Mead better than anyone. Its lanes, its people, its secrets. They were an open book to her, though. She read it with a gentle smile and a knack for asking just the right questions. Mr. Grayson's murder was no random act. Someone had planned it. struck him down in the churchyard with a single blow and melted back into the village's daily life. The killer was clever, but Miss Marple was cleverer. She stood, smoothing her skirt, and chose a practical hat, a gray one with a small brim, perfect for a day of poking around. Her walking stick tapped the floor as she grabbed her coat and stepped outside, ready to dig deeper. The high street was awake, though quieter than usual. People moved with purpose, their faces tight with worry. Miss Marple headed first to Mrs. Carter's shop, a cramped little store stuffed with jars of sweets, spools of thread, and stacks of newspapers. The bell jingled as she entered, and Mrs. Carter looked up from her counter, her round face pale. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, forcing a smile. "Bread or needles today?" "Just a chat if you got a moment," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. She leaned on her stick, her eyes scanning the shop. A newspaper on the counter had a headline about the murder, but it was light on details. "The village is still shaken, isn't it, poor Mr. Grayson?" Mrs. Carter nodded, her hands fidgeting with a cloth. "It's awful. I keep thinking about him lying there in the churchyard. Who could do such a thing?" Her voice trembled, and she glanced at the door as if expecting someone to burst in. Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone gentle. "You saw him often, didn't you?" "He was particular about his orders, I hear." Mrs. Carter's lips tightened. "He was fussy, that's for sure. Always checking the change, counting every penny. Last week he snapped at me for being late with candles for the church, said I was careless, me." Her cheeks flushed and she looked away. Miss Marple nodded, her face kind, but her mind sharp. Mrs. Carter's anger was real, but was it enough to kill? "It must be hard running the shop with everyone so particular," she said. "Have you noticed anything odd lately? Strangers, perhaps?" Mrs. Carter hesitated, then leaned closer. "There was a man in here 2 days before. You know, not Mr. Baxter, someone else. Tall, with a dark coat and a hat pulled low. He bought matches and asked about the church service times. Didn't say much, but he gave me the shivers." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her smile soft. "A hat, you say? That's interesting. Did he give a name?" "No, and I didn't ask," Mrs. Carter said. "He paid and left. Quick. I haven't seen him since." Miss Marple thanked her and bought a small packet of tea, tucking the clue away. The man in the hat again. By the church, by the pond, and now in the shop. He was a shadow moving through the village, and she needed to know why. She left the shop and headed toward the church, where the police were still poking around. The churchyard was quieter today, the tape gone, but a constable stood by the gate, looking bored. Miss Marple slowed her steps, her eyes scanning the ground near the yew tree where she'd seen the shoe mark. The mud was drier now, but the mark was still there, faint and deep, like the heel of a man's boot. She made a mental note to compare it later if she could. Inspector Slack was inside the church talking to the vicar. Miss Marple slipped in quietly, taking a pew near the back. The church smelled of old wood and candle wax, its stained glass, windows casting colored light on the stone floor. She listened as the vicar, a nervous man named Mr. Bell, spoke in a low voice. "Mr. Grayson was here that evening," he said. "He came to check the collection plate records. He was particular about money, you know." "Did he seem worried?" Inspector Slack asked, his pencil scratching in a notebook. "Not worried." "Exactly," Mr. Bell said. "But he was distracted, kept looking at his watch like he was expecting someone." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. Expecting someone? That was new. She watched Inspector Slack nod, his face impatient. He didn't ask more, but Miss Marple would. She waited until he left, then approached the vicar. "Mr. Bell," she said, her voice gentle. "I couldn't help overhearing. It's so sad about Mr. Grayson. Did he mention who he was meeting?" Mr. Bell blinked, startled. "Oh, Miss Marple. No, he didn't say. Just that he had to finish the records quickly. I didn't think much of it at the time." His hands twisted, together, and he glanced toward the vicarage. Miss Marple smiled. "You've got enough on your mind with your cousin staying. How is Clara settling in?" Mr. Bell's face tightened. "She's fine. A bit overwhelmed by the village, that's all." He looked away, his voice too quick. Miss Marple nodded, not pressing. Mr. Bell was hiding something, just like his wife. She thanked him and left the church, her mind buzzing. Mr. Grayson had been expecting someone the night he died. Was it the man in the hat or someone else in the village? She needed to talk to Clara, but that would take careful planning. The young woman was scared, and scared people didn't talk easily. Her next stop was the Rose and Crown Inn. The inn was busier now, with men stopping for lunch. Mr. Baxter was there, his loud voice carrying as he told a story about a horse race. Miss Marple took a table near the window, ordering a glass of lemonade. She watched Mr. Baxter, noting how his eyes flicked to the door every few minutes. Sally, the barmaid, brought her drink, and Miss Marple seized the chance to chat. "Mr. Baxter seems in good spirits," she said. "Has he been asking about anyone else besides Mr. Grayson?" Sally glanced at Mr. Baxter, then leaned closer. "He's been curious about the vicarage, too. Asked me yesterday if I knew who was staying there. I told him it was just Mrs. Bell's cousin, but he seemed too interested, you know." Miss Marple's mind raced. Mr. Baxter, asking about Clara now? That was no coincidence. She thanked Sally and sipped her lemonade, watching as Mr. Baxter laughed with Mr. Thomas, the butcher. Mr. Thomas looked tense, his hands gripping his glass tightly. Miss Marple remembered Dolly's story about his argument with Mr. Grayson over the church fete money. Could that be a motive? She needed to find out more. She left the inn and headed to the butcher's shop, where Mr. Thomas was behind the counter, chopping meat with a heavy cleaver. He was a burly man with a red face and a quick temper. Miss Marple smiled as she entered. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thomas," she said. "I'll take a bit of your nice bacon, please." Mr. Thomas nodded, his movements sharp. "Terrible thing about Grayson," he muttered as he sliced. "Didn't deserve that, even if he was a pain." "He could be strict," Miss Marple said, watching his face. "I heard he was cross with you about the fate funds." Mr. Thomas's knife paused and his eyes narrowed. "Who told you that?" "Grayson was always picking fights. Said I shorted the church 10 pounds. 10 pounds. I paid my share, but he wouldn't let it go." His voice was loud and he slammed the cleaver down. Miss Marple kept her smile. "I'm sure it was a misunderstanding. Did you see him that night by any chance?" Mr. Thomas shook his head too quickly. "No, I was here closing up. Ask anyone." He wrapped the bacon and handed it to her, his hands steady but his eyes avoiding hers. Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind turning over his words. Mr. Thomas was defensive, and his alibi was too pat. She added him to her list of suspects along with Mr. Baxter and the mysterious man in the hat. As she walked back toward the village green, she passed the duck pond, where Tommy was skipping stones. She stopped, her stick tapping the ground. "Hello, Tommy," she said. "Any more sightings of that man with the hat?" Tommy looked up, his face serious. "Not since that night, Miss Marple, but I found something by the pond this morning." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, shiny object, a cufflink, silver, with a tiny engraved initial. R. Miss Marple's heart skipped. "Where did you find this, Tommy?" "By the reeds near where that man was standing," he said. "I thought it looked fancy, so I kept it." "You're a clever boy," Miss Marple said, patting his shoulder. "May I hold on to it for now? It might be important." Tommy nodded, handing it over. Miss Marple tucked the cufflink into her purse, her mind racing. An R. Whose initial was that? She needed to check the village names, but it was another clue, small but sharp. She returned to her cottage, the sun now high but the village still quiet. She sat by her window, pulling out a small notebook where she jotted down her thoughts. The man in the hat seen by the church, the pond, and the shop. Clara's fear and the Bell's secrecy. Mr. Baxter's questions about Grayson and the vicarage. Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the button, the cufflink with an R, and the missing letter from the manor. Each was a thread, and Mr. Grayson's murder was the knot tying them together. That afternoon she decided to visit the manor again. Dolly Bantry was in her garden, pulling weeds with a vigor that suggested she was working off worry. "Jane," she called. brushing dirt from her hands. "You're out sleuthing again, aren't you?" "Just stretching my legs, Miss Marple," said, smiling. "But I did wonder about that missing letter from the Colonel's study. Any news?" Dolly frowned. "It's the oddest thing. It was just a letter from an old friend. Nothing valuable, but it's gone. And the Colonel swears he saw someone near the manor the night before Grayson died. A tall figure, moving fast." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Another sighting of the stranger? "Did he see a hat?" she asked. Dolly nodded. "He did mention a hat. Said it was pulled low like the man was hiding his face." Miss Marple thanked her and headed home, her mind spinning. The stranger was everywhere. Church, pond, shop, manor. Was he the killer or a witness? And what did Clara know that made her so afraid? She needed to talk to the young woman, but the bells were guarding her like a treasure. That evening, the village held a meeting at the church hall to discuss the murder. Miss Marple attended, sitting quietly at the back. The room was packed with Inspector Slack at the front, looking important. He talked about the investigation, saying little but sounding confident. Miss Marple watched the crowd. Clara was there, sitting close to Mrs. Bell, her hands twisting in her lap. Mr. Baxter was loud, asking questions that sounded innocent but felt pointed. Mr. Thomas glowered in a corner, and Mrs. Carter kept glancing at the door. When the meeting ended, Miss Marple lingered, hoping to catch Clara alone. But Mrs. Bell whisked her away, leaving Miss Marple with only a glimpse of the young woman's pale face. She walked home slowly, the night cool and starry. The village seemed peaceful, but she knew better. A killer was hiding among them, clever and bold. She thought of the cufflink, the shoe mark, the button and the letter. She thought of the stranger, Clara, Mr. Baxter, and Mr. Thomas. The truth was close, hidden in the village's quiet corners. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking. The village slept, but she was awake, her mind piecing together the puzzle. The murderer thought they were safe, but they didn't know Miss Marple. She was closing in, one small clue at a time. Chapter 4. The Curious Will. The fourth day after Mr. Grayson's murder broke with a pale sun struggling through heavy clouds over St. Mary Mead. The village, usually alive with chatter and the clatter of daily life, felt hushed, as if the weight of the crime had settled into its bones. The air smelled of damp leaves and wood smoke, and the cobblestone lanes glistened with morning dew. Miss Jane Marple sat at her small dining table, her tea growing cold as she stared out at the village. Green. Her knitting lay untouched, her sharp blue eyes distant but alert. The murder of Mr. Grayson was a puzzle with too many pieces. The stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's nosy questions, Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the button, the cufflink with an R, and the missing letter from Colonel Bantry's study. Each was a clue, but none told the whole story. Today, Miss Marple felt, something new would surface, something to tie the threads together. She had spent the previous evening thinking about the village meeting, where the tension among the villagers had been as thick as the mist. Clara's nervous glances, Mr. Baxter's loud questions, Mr. Thomas's scowl, and Mrs. Carter's quick exits. They all pointed to secrets. Miss Marple knew secrets were like weeds. Pull one, and you find a tangle of roots. Her task was to keep pulling, gently but firmly, until the truth came up. She stood, slipping on her coat and a plain hat with a small feather, her walking stick in hand. Today she would visit the vicarage again, but first she had another stop to make. The high street was stirring, though the usual cheer was missing. People nodded politely but hurried along, their faces drawn. Miss Marple headed to the post office, a tiny building next to Mrs. Carter's shop, where Mr. Hodges sorted letters and shared gossip as freely as stamps. He was behind the counter, his glasses perched on his nose, sorting a pile of envelopes. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, looking up. "Terrible business, this murder. Makes you wonder who's next?" "It's unsettling," Miss Marple agreed, her voice soft. "Mr. Grayson was such a fixture at the church. Did he ever mention anything troubling to you? Money matters, perhaps?" Mr. Hodges paused, his hands still. "Money?" Well, he was always fussing about the church funds. Said someone was skimming from the collection plate, but he never named names. Got quite worked up about it last week, though. Said he'd sort it out himself. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her face calm. Sort it out? Did he say how? Mr. Hodges shook his head. No, but he was carrying a letter that day. Looked important, sealed with wax. Said it was for his lawyer. I didn't think much of it, but now. His voice trailed off and he shrugged. Miss Marple thanked him and bought a few stamps, her mind racing. A letter to a lawyer? That could be a will, or something else tied to the church funds. It was another thread, and it might connect to the missing letter from the manor. She left the post office and headed toward the vicarage, her stick tapping the ground. The vicarage garden was quiet, the roses drooping under the cloudy sky. Mrs. Lucy Bell was inside, setting out tea things, but Clara was nowhere to be seen. Miss Marple knocked, and Mrs. Bell opened the door, her face tired but polite. Jane, how nice to see you, Mrs. Bell said, though her smile was strained. Come in, have some tea. Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes scanning the cozy parlor. A fire crackled in the hearth, but the room felt tense. Thank you, Lucy, she said, settling into a chair. I was hoping to see Clara, too. Is she out? Mrs. Bell's hands froze on the teapot. She's resting, she said quickly. The village? It's been a lot for her. Miss Marple nodded, her tone gentle. Of course, it's a shock for us all. Poor Mr. Grayson. I hear he was working on church matters the night he died. Something about the funds, perhaps? Mrs. Bell's eyes flicked to the side. He was always busy with the church books. I don't know details. That was his job, not ours. Her voice was too sharp and she busied herself pouring tea. Miss Marple sipped her tea, watching Mrs. Bell's hands shake slightly. It's odd, isn't it? How money can cause such trouble, she said casually. Mr. Hodges mentioned a letter Grayson sent to his lawyer. Do you know anything about that? Mrs. Bell's cup clinked against its saucer. A letter? No, I don't think so. He never mentioned it to me. She stood suddenly. I need to check the scones. Excuse me. Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was sharp. Mrs. Bell was hiding something, and it likely involved Clara. She finished her tea and left, promising to visit again. As she stepped outside, she saw Clara at the garden gate, looking pale and jumpy. Miss Marple approached, her voice warm. Clara, dear, I'm Miss Marple. I don't think we've met properly. Clara started, her eyes wide. Oh, hello, I'm just helping Lucy. Her hands twisted together, and she glanced toward the vicarage. You must find the village overwhelming, Miss Marple said, especially with this sad business about Mr. Grayson. Did you know him? Clara shook her head quickly. No, not really. I saw him at church, that's all. Her voice was high, and she stepped back, as if eager to escape. Miss Marple didn't. Push. Well, if you need a friendly ear, my cottage is just down the lane. She smiled and walked away, her mind noting Clara's fear. The young woman knew something, but getting it out of her would take time. Her next stop was the Rose and Crown Inn, where Mr. Baxter was likely to be. The inn was busy with lunchtime chatter, and Mr. Baxter sat at his usual table, his loud laugh echoing. Miss Marple took a seat nearby, ordering a small glass of sherry. She watched him, noting how he scanned the room, his eyes lingering on Mr. Thomas, who was eating alone. Sally, the barmaid, brought her drink, and Miss Marple seized the chance to talk. Mr. Baxter seems to know everyone, she said lightly. Has he mentioned why he's so curious about the village? Sally leaned closer, her voice low. He's been asking about Grayson's will. Said he heard Grayson had money tucked away. Wanted to know who'd get it. I told him I don't know anything, but he kept pushing. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. A will? That tied to Mr. Hodges's story about the letter. When did he ask about this? She said, keeping her tone casual. Yesterday, after the meeting, Sally said. He was talking to Mr. Thomas too, but they got quiet when I came near. Miss Marple thanked her and sipped her sherry, her eyes on Mr. Baxter. He was asking about a will, and he'd been seen near the church before, the murder. She needed to know more about him. She left the inn and headed to the butcher's shop, where Mr. Thomas was cleaning his counter. His face was redder than usual, and he barely looked up as she entered. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thomas," Miss Marple said. "I'll take some sausages, please. It's been a hard few days, hasn't it?" Mr. Thomas grunted, slicing meat with quick, angry strokes. "Hard's one word for it. Grayson didn't deserve that, but he wasn't a saint either." "I hear he accused you of shorting the church funds," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "That must have stung." Mr. Thomas's knife stopped and his eyes flashed. He had no proof, just liked making trouble. "I told him to check his precious books again, but he wouldn't listen." He wrapped the sausages, his hands rough. "Did you see him that night?" Miss Marple asked, watching his face. "No," he snapped. "I was here working late. Ask my wife." His voice was firm, but his eyes slid away. Miss Marple paid and left, her mind turning over his words. Mr. Thomas's alibi was solid, but his anger was raw. She walked back to the village green, passing the duck pond where Tommy was fishing with a stick. She stopped, smiling. "Any luck, Tommy?" He grinned, holding up a small net. "Not yet, Miss Marple, but I found something else by the pond." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, damp and torn. "It was in the reeds near where I got that cufflink." Miss Marple took the paper, her heart beating faster. It was a fragment of a letter, with only a few words legible. "Must change. Will. Urgent." The handwriting was neat, like Mr. Grayson's. She thanked Tommy, tucking the paper into her purse beside the cufflink. A will, a letter, and a murder. The pieces were starting to fit. She decided to visit Dolly Bantry again, hoping for more gossip. The manor house was quiet, its lawn damp from the morning's mist. Dolly was in the drawing room, sorting through old photos. "Jane," she said, waving her in. "You're out sniffing for clues, aren't you?" Miss Marple laughed. "Just visiting, Dolly. But I did hear something about Mr. Grayson's will. Did he ever mention it to you or the Colonel?" Dolly's eyes widened. "A will? Well, now you mention it. He did say something odd a month ago. Said he was updating his papers, making sure things were fair. I thought he meant the church accounts, but maybe not. And that missing letter from the Colonel's study. It was from Grayson's lawyer, I think. The Colonel said it mentioned an appointment." Miss Marple's mind raced. A will, a lawyer, and a missing letter. She chatted with Dolly a bit longer, learning that Mr. Baxter had been seen near the manor again, lurking by the gate. As she left, she felt the puzzle growing clearer. Mr. Grayson had been changing his will and someone didn't like it. That evening, she attended a small gathering at the church hall where the village discussed the murder's impact. Inspector Slack was there, looking frustrated, and Miss Marple watched the crowd. Clara was absent, but Mrs. Bell was nervous, her hands twisting her shawl. Mr. Baxter talked loudly, asking about Grayson's family, and Mr. Thomas sat silently, his face dark. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Carter slip out early, clutching her bag, tightly. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking. She pulled out the torn letter and the cufflink, studying them. The will was the key. Someone had wanted it hidden or destroyed. The stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions, Mr. Thomas's anger, and the missing letter all pointed to it. She thought of the shoe mark, the button, and the R on the cufflink. The killer was close, hiding in plain sight. The village slept under a cloudy sky, but Miss Marple's mind was awake, piecing together the clues. A cunning murderer thought they were safe, but she was closer than ever, and she wouldn't stop until the truth was out. Chapter 5. Shadows of Suspect. The 5th day after Mr. Grayson's murder dawned with a chill that clung to St. Mary Mead like a damp shawl. The village, usually bright with morning bustle, felt subdued, its lanes quiet under a sky heavy with gray clouds. The scent of wet grass and chimney smoke filled the air, and the duck pond rippled under a restless breeze. Miss Jane Marple sat at her cottage window, her tea untouched, her knitting idle on the table. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the village green, but her mind was weaving through the clues she'd gathered. The stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions about the will, Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the button, the cufflink with an R, the missing letter from the manor, and the torn paper hinting at a will. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was still blurry. Today, Miss Marple knew she needed to cast a wider net to catch the shadows of suspicion lurking in the village. Mr. Grayson's murder was no spur-of-the-moment act. Someone had planned it, struck him down in the churchyard with a single blow, and slipped back into the village's routine. The will mentioned by Mr. Hodges and hinted at in the torn letter was key. Someone stood to gain, or lose, by its contents, and Miss Marple was determined to find out who. She stood, pulling, on her coat and a sensible hat with a tiny bow, her walking stick ready. Her plan was to visit the church first, then track down Clara, who was still a mystery wrapped in fear. But as she stepped outside, the cold air sharpened her resolve. The killer was close, hiding behind familiar faces, and she would find them. The B.A. High Street was stirring, though the usual chatter was hushed. People glanced over their shoulders, their eyes wary. Miss Marple headed to the church, where the air smelled of damp stone and old hymns. The churchyard was quiet now. The police, tape gone, but the spot where Mr. Grayson had been found was still marked by trampled grass. She paused by the yew tree, her eyes on the faint shoe mark she'd noticed before. It was deeper than she'd thought, suggesting a heavy step, perhaps a man's. She bent closer, pretending to adjust her scarf, and saw something new. A tiny scrap of fabric caught on a low branch, dark blue and frayed. She slipped it into her purse beside the cufflink and torn letter, her heart quickening. Another clue, small but sharp. Inside the church, Mr. Bell, the vicar, was polishing the brass candlesticks, his hands moving slowly, his face tired. Miss Marple approached, her smile gentle. "Good morning, Mr. Bell," she said. "The church looks lovely, despite everything." He looked up, his eyes nervous. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's hard to keep things normal with Mr. Grayson gone." His voice was soft, but his hand shook slightly. Miss Marple nodded, her tone kind. "He was so dedicated to the church. I hear he was working on the accounts that night. Did he ever mention the will he was changing?" Mr. Bell's face paled and he dropped the cloth. "A will? No, he didn't say anything specific. Just that he was sorting out some papers. He was always private about personal matters." He bent to pick up the cloth, his movements jerky. Miss Marple watched him closely. "Of course. It must be a strain with Clara staying with you. Is she feeling better?" Mr. Bell hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. "She's managing. The village is overwhelming for her." His voice was tight and he turned back to the candlesticks. Miss Marple didn't push. Mr. Bell was as guarded as his wife, and Clara was clearly at the heart of their secrecy. She thanked him and left, her mind turning over his words. Mr. Grayson had been sorting papers, possibly the will, the night he died. Had someone seen those papers and panicked? She headed to the vicarage, hoping to catch Clara alone. The vicarage was quiet, its garden damp and still. Mrs. Bell was out, but Clara answered the door, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice shaky. Mrs. Bell isn't here." "That's all right, dear," Miss Marple said, her smile warm. "I just wanted to see how you're settling in. It must be hard, with all this talk of murder." Clara's hands twisted together. "It's awful. I didn't know Mr. Grayson, but it's scary." She glanced behind her, as if expecting someone to appear. Miss Marple tilted her head. "You mentioned seeing someone watching the vicarage. Was it the man with the hat?" Clara froze, her breath catching. I don't know. It was dark. I just saw a shadow, someone tall. Please, I don't want to talk about it." She stepped back, her hand on the door. Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle. "I understand. If you ever need to chat, my door's open." She turned away, her mind racing. Clara's fear was real, and it was tied to the stranger. But why was she so scared? Was she hiding from someone or protecting someone? Her next stop was the Rose and Crown Inn, where Mr. Baxter was likely holding court. The inn was lively, with men laughing over pints. Mr. Baxter sat at his usual table, his red face glowing as he told a story about a London auction. Miss Marple took a seat nearby, ordering a cup of tea. She watched him, noting how his eyes flicked to the door, as if waiting for someone. Sally, the barmaid, brought her tea, and Miss Marple seized the chance to talk. "Mr. Baxter seems popular," she said. "Has he mentioned the will again?" Sally nodded, her voice low. "He was at it this morning, asking if Grayson had family in the village. Said he heard there was money involved, maybe a big inheritance. I told him I don't know anything, but he's persistent." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Did he say where he heard about the will?" "No, just that he knows people in town," Sally said. "He was talking to Mr. Thomas yesterday, and they looked cozy until I walked by." Miss Marple thanked her and sipped her tea, her eyes on Mr. Baxter. He was too interested in the will, and his connection to Mr. Thomas was troubling. She needed to know more about their talks. She left the inn and headed to the butcher's shop, where Mr. Thomas was sharpening a knife, his face set in a scowl. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thomas," Miss Marple said, her voice bright. "I'll take a small roast, please. It's been a trying time, hasn't it?" Mr. Thomas grunted, his knife scraping the stone. "Trying? That's putting it lightly. Grayson's murder's got everyone jumpy, and the police keep asking questions." "They're thorough," Miss Marple said, watching his hands. "I hear Grayson was changing his will. Did he ever mention it to you with all the church business?" Mr. Thomas's knife stopped and his eyes narrowed. "A will? No, he didn't tell me anything. Why would he? I just supplied meat for the fete. He was always on about money, though. Said I owed him, which I didn't." His voice was sharp, and he slammed the knife down. Miss Marple kept her smile. "Of course. Did you see anyone near the church that night? A stranger, perhaps?" "No," he said quickly. "I was here, cleaning up, my wife can tell you." His eyes darted away, and he wrapped the roast with quick, angry movements. Miss Marple paid and left, her mind turning over his words. Mr. Thomas's alibi was the same, but his anger was sharper today. Was he hiding something, or just fed up with questions? She walked to the village green, where Tommy was playing with a stick, chasing ducks. She stopped, smiling. "Tommy, you're good at finding things," she said. "Anything new by the pond?" Tommy grinned, his face bright. "I found a coin yesterday, near where I got that paper. It's old, with a funny mark." He pulled a small tarnished coin from his pocket, its edge worn but a faint R visible. Miss Marple's heart skipped. "Another R?" She took the coin, turning it over. "You're a treasure, Tommy. Can I keep this for now?" He nodded, and she tucked it into her purse, her mind racing. The cufflink, the coin, both with an R. Was it a coincidence, or a sign of the killer? She decided to visit Dolly Bantry, hoping for more on the missing letter. The manor house was quiet, its tall windows reflecting the gray sky. Dolly was in the parlor, knitting a lumpy scarf. "Jane," she said, waving her in. "You're out chasing clues, aren't you?" Miss Marple laughed. "Just visiting, Dolly, but I did wonder about that letter from Grayson's lawyer. Any sign of it?" Dolly shook her head. "Gone, like it was never there. The Colonel's sure it was about Grayson's will. Said it mentioned a meeting the day he died, and he saw that man again near the gate last night, tall with a hat." Miss Marple's mind sharpened. The stranger again, and a letter about a will. "Did the Colonel see his face?" she asked. "No, too dark," Dolly said. "But he's sure it was the same man from before." Miss Marple thanked her and headed home, her thoughts swirling. The will was at the heart of the murder, and the stranger was tied to it. But what about Clara, Mr. Baxter, and Mr. Thomas? She sat by her fire, pulling out her notebook. She added the scrap of fabric, the coin, and the new details about the will. The R was a clue, but whose initial was it? She listed names: Robert, Richard, Roger. None matched anyone obvious in the village. That evening, a small group gathered at the church for a prayer vigil. Miss Marple attended, her eyes on the crowd. Clara was there, sitting close to Mrs. Bell, her face pale. Mr. Baxter was loud, offering condolences, but his eyes were sharp. Mr. Thomas stood at the back, his arms crossed. Mrs. Carter was absent, which was odd. Miss Marple noticed Clara slip a small note into her pocket, her hands trembling. Another clue, but too far to see. As she walked home, the village was dark, the clouds hiding the stars. Miss Marple's mind was alive, piecing together the clues. The will, the stranger, the R, the fabric, each pointed to a killer hiding in plain sight. She was close, but the puzzle wasn't complete. The murderer thought they were safe, but Miss Marple's net was tightening, one quiet step at a time. Chapter 6. Tea and Secrets. The 6th day after Mr. Grayson's murder brought a soft rain to St. Mary Mead, pattering gently on the thatched roofs and turning the cobblestone lanes slick. The village seemed to huddle under the gray sky, its usual cheer dampened by the weight of the unsolved crime. The air smelled of wet earth and blooming lavender, a faint sweetness cutting through the gloom. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy cottage, her knitting resting on the table beside a steaming teapot. Her sharp blue eyes gazed out at the misty village green, but her mind was busy, sorting through the growing pile of clues. The stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions about the will, Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the button, the cufflink with an R, the torn letter, the missing letter from the manor, the scrap of fabric, and the coin with the same mysterious R. Each was a thread in the tapestry of murder, and Miss Marple was determined to weave them together. The will was at the heart of it, she was sure. Mr. Grayson had been changing it, and someone had killed him to stop it, or to hide what it contained. The stranger in the hat was a shadow across the village, seen by the church, the pond, the shop, and the manor. Clara's fear hinted at a deeper connection, and Mr. Baxter's curiosity about the will was too pointed to be innocent. Mr. Thomas's temper made him a suspect, but so did Mrs. Carter's odd behavior. Miss Marple knew the truth lay in the village's secrets, and secrets, she found, often spilled over a cup of tea. Today she would invite a few key people to her cottage, using the promise of warmth and scones to loosen tongues. She stood, smoothing her skirt, and chose a soft blue, that matched her coat. Her walking stick tapped the floor as she checked the kettle and set out her best china. She wrote 3 quick notes inviting Mrs. Bell, Mrs. Carter, and Dolly Bantry for tea that afternoon. She didn't include Clara. The young woman was too skittish for a group, but Miss Marple had a plan for her later. She handed the notes to Tommy, who was passing by with a grin, and asked him to deliver them. "You're my best messenger, Tommy," she said, slipping him a penny. His eyes lit up, and he darted off into the rain. Miss Marple spent the morning tidying her parlor, setting out a tray of scones and jam. The fire crackled, warming the small room, and the scent of tea filled the air. She placed her notebook in a drawer, keeping her clues hidden but her mind sharp. By noon the rain had slowed to a drizzle and the village was stirring. She saw Mr. Hodges pedaling through the mist, his mailbag soaked and children splashing in puddles by the duck pond. The church bell rang faintly, a reminder of the vigil and the murder that still haunted St. Mary Mead. At 2 o'clock her guests arrived. Dolly Bantry came first, shaking rain from her umbrella and bustling in with a cheerful smile. "Jane, you're a saint for inviting us on such a dreary day," she said, hanging her coat. "This murder's got everyone on edge. I need a good chat to settle my nerves." Mrs. Bell arrived next, her face pale and her hands clutching a damp shawl. "Thank you, Jane," she said quietly, her eyes darting to the window. "It's kind of you to have us." Mrs. Carter was last, her round face flushed from the walk. "What a day," she muttered, brushing water from her hair. "This rain's bad for business and the murder's worse." Miss Marple smiled, pouring tea into delicate cups. "It's nice to have company," she said. "The village feels so heavy lately. Poor Mr. Grayson. I keep thinking about his Work at the church, he was so careful with the accounts, wasn't he? Mrs. Bell nodded, her hands tight around her cup. Very careful. He checked every penny, sometimes twice. It made him unpopular at times. Dolly leaned forward, her eyes bright. Unpopular's putting it mildly. He was always snapping at someone. Remember how he scolded Mr. Thomas about the fate money? The colonel said it was quite a row. Mrs. Carter's face tightened. He was sharp with me too, she said. Told me my candles were late and overpriced, as if I'd cheat the church. Her voice rose and she set her cup down hard. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes soft but watchful. It's sad how money causes trouble, she said. I heard Mr. Grayson was updating his will. That must have been important with all his church duties. Mrs. Bell's cup rattled in its saucer. A will? I didn't know about that. He never mentioned it to me or my husband. Her voice was too quick and she looked away. Dolly's eyebrows rose. A will? Well, that's news. The colonel said Grayson's lawyer sent a letter, but it's gone missing from our study. Maybe it was about the will. Mrs. Carter frowned. Who'd get his money? He didn't have family here, did he? Miss Marple watched their faces, noting Mrs. Bell's nerves, Mrs. Carter's curiosity, and Dolly's gossip-hungry gleam. I'm not sure, she said. But it's odd, isn't it? A letter missing and then a murder. Do any of you know someone with the initial R? I found a coin with an R on it and it made me wonder. Mrs. Bell's face went white and she spilled a drop of tea. An R? No, I don't think so. Her hands shook and she set her cup down. Mrs. Carter shrugged. Could be anyone. Robert, Richard. There's a few in the village. Why's it matter? Dolly leaned in, her voice low. Jane, you're onto something, aren't you? Is it a clue? The colonel's friend Roger lives in Much Benham, but he hasn't been here in ages. Miss Marple smiled, keeping her tone light. Just a thought. The village is full of little mysteries, isn't it? She steered the talk to safer topics. Gardens, the weather. But her mind was sharp. Mrs. Bell's reaction to the R was telling. Was it fear or guilt? And Mrs. Carter's quick dismissal felt forced. The tea went on, with scones and polite chatter, but Miss Marple's eyes missed nothing. After her guests left, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her notebook open. She added the day's observations. Mrs. Bell's fear at the mention of the R, Mrs. Carter's defensiveness, and Dolly's hint about the lawyer's letter. The will was the key, but who stood to gain? She needed to know more about Mr. Grayson's life, his friends, his enemies, his money. She decided to visit the Rose and Crown Inn, where Mr. Baxter might let something slip. The inn was warm and noisy, the smell of ale and roasted meat filling the air. Mr. Baxter sat at his usual table, his loud voice carrying over the chatter. Miss Marple took a seat nearby, ordering a small glass of sherry. She watched him, noting how he glanced at Mr. Thomas, who was drinking alone in a corner. Sally, the barmaid, brought her drink, and Miss Marple smiled. Mr. Baxter seems cheerful, she said. Has he been asking about the will again? Sally nodded, her voice low. All the time. Last night he was talking to a man I didn't know. Tall, with a dark coat. They were whispering about Grayson's money, but they stopped when I came near. Miss Marple's heart skipped. The stranger in the hat? Did this man wear a hat? She asked. Yes, pulled low, Sally said. He left quick, didn't even finish his drink. Miss Marple thanked her and sipped her sherry, her eyes on Mr. Baxter. He was too curious about the will, and now he was meeting the stranger. Was he involved or just nosy? She needed to know more about his business, in the village. She left the inn and headed to the butcher's shop where Mr. Thomas was closing up, his face dark. Good evening, Mr. Thomas, Miss Marple said, her voice bright. I forgot to ask earlier, did Mr. Grayson ever mention his will to you? With all the church business, I thought he might have. Mr. Thomas's hands froze on the lock. No, he snapped. Why would he? He was always on about money, but nothing about a will. I was busy that night anyway. Ask my wife. His voice was sharp and he turned away. Miss Marple nodded, her smile calm. His alibi was the same, but his anger was hotter. She walked, back to the village green where Tommy was kicking a ball. "Tommy," she called, "any more treasures from the pond?" He ran over, grinning. "Found a key this morning, Miss Marple. It was in the mud near the reeds." He handed her a small rusty key with a tag that read church. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. A church key? She thanked Tommy, tucking it into her purse with the cufflink, coin, fabric, and torn letter. The key could be to the church office, where Grayson kept the accounts. Had he dropped it, or had the killer? She needed to check the church again. That evening, she slipped into the church, the key heavy in her pocket. The office was a small room off the vestry, its door locked. She tried the key and it turned smoothly. Inside, the desk was tidy, but a drawer was slightly open. She found a ledger, its pages marked with Grayson's neat handwriting. One entry caught her eye. Discrepancy, $50 missing, suspect T. T for Thomas? She closed the drawer, her mind racing. The key was a clue, and the ledger pointed to trouble. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking. She added the key and ledger to her notebook. The will, the stranger, the R, the fabric, the key. Each was a step closer to the truth. Mrs. Bell's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions, Mr. Thomas's anger, and Clara's secrecy all pointed to a killer hiding in the village. The rain fell softly outside, but Miss Marple's mind was clear, piecing together the puzzle. The murderer was clever, but she was closer than ever, and she wouldn't stop until they were caught. Chapter 7. The Locked Room Riddle. The 7th day after Mr. Grayson's murder dawned with a sharp chill in St. Mary Mead, the kind that crept into your bones and made the village feel smaller, tighter, as if it were holding its breath. A thin fog clung to the cobblestone lanes, softening the outlines of the thatched cottages and muffling the quack of ducks by the pond. The air smelled of damp earth and fading roses, a reminder of the fleeting summer. Miss Jane Marple sat at her cottage window, her tea cooling in its cup, her knitting untouched on the table. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the misty village green, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over the clues she'd gathered. The stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions about the will, Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the phi button, the cufflink with an R, the torn letter, the missing letter from the manor, the scrap of fabric, the coin with an R, and the rusty church key with its tag. Last night's discovery of the church ledger, with its note about a $50 discrepancy and a suspect T, had added weight to her suspicions. Today, a new puzzle had emerged. A locked room in the church, and Miss Marple was determined to solve it. The church key she'd found, thanks to Tommy, had unlocked the office where Mr. Grayson kept the accounts. The ledger's hint of missing money pointed to trouble, possibly involving Mr. Thomas, but the office itself was a riddle. Mr. Bell had mentioned it was always locked, yet the key had been in the pond, and the drawer was ajar. Had Grayson dropped it in a struggle, or had the killer taken it? Miss Marple knew the answers lay in the village's quiet corners, in the nervous glances and half-spoken truths. She stood, pulling on her coat and a plain hat with a small ribbon, her walking stick ready. Today she would return to the church, talk to Clara if she could, and keep an eye on Mr. Baxter and Mr. Thomas. The killer was close, and she was closer. The high street was hushed, the fog softening the clatter of footsteps and the jingle of shop bells. Miss Marple headed to the church first, its stone tower looming through the mist. The churchyard was empty, the grass still trampled where Mr. Grayson had been found. She paused by the yew tree, checking the shoe mark. Still there, deep and clear, a man's heel, she was sure. The scrap of fabric she'd found was in her purse, dark blue and frayed, possibly from a coat. She entered the church, the air cool and heavy with the scent of wax and old wood. Mr. Bell was there, arranging hymnals, his face pale and his hands unsteady. "Good morning, Mr. Bell," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "The church feels so quiet today. I was thinking about poor Mr. Grayson and his work in the office. Was it always locked?" Mr. Bell jumped slightly, his eyes darting to the vestry door. Yes, always, he said. Grayson was particular about that. Only he and I had keys. I don't know where his went. Miss Marple nodded, her smile gentle. That's odd, isn't it? With the account so important, did he ever mention trouble with the money? A discrepancy, perhaps? Mr. Bell's hands froze on a hymnal. Trouble? No, he said everything was fine, just needed checking. His voice was too quick, and he looked away. Miss Marple watched him closely. Of course. It must be hard with Clara staying. Is she helping with church duties? Mr. Bell's face tightened. She's not up to it. She's been unwell, staying in her room. He turned back to the hymnals, his shoulders stiff. Miss Marple didn't push. Mr. Bell was hiding something, just like his wife. She thanked him and slipped into the vestry, her eyes on the office door. It was locked again, but the key in her purse turned smoothly. Inside, the room was as she'd left it, tidy, with the ledger in the drawer. She checked it again, finding another entry, meeting with R, urgent, will. Her heart quickened. An R again. The same as the cufflink and coin. She closed the drawer, locking the door behind her. The office was a locked room riddle, and the key in the pond suggested someone had wanted it gone. She left the church and headed to the vicarage, hoping to catch Clara. The garden was damp, the roses drooping under the fog. Mrs. Bell answered the door, her face tired. Jane, what a surprise, she said, her smile forced. Clara's resting, I'm afraid. That's all right, Miss Marple said. I just wanted to drop off some jam, but I was wondering, did Mr. Grayson ever mention a meeting about his will? It seems important now. Mrs. Bell's hands gripped the doorframe. A will? No, he never said anything to me. Why do you ask? Her voice was sharp and her eyes flicked to the stairs. Miss Marple smiled, her tone light. Just village talk. People say he was changing it. Maybe someone named R was involved. She watched Mrs. Bell's face closely. The woman's eyes widened and she stepped back. I don't know any R. Excuse me, I need to check on Clara. She closed the door quickly, leaving Miss Marple on the step. Miss Marple's mind raced. Mrs. Bell's reaction to the R was stronger than before. Was Clara the R, or someone else? She headed to the Rose and Crown Inn, where Mr. Baxter was likely stirring up gossip. The inn was warm, the smell of bread and ale cutting through the fog. Mr. Baxter sat at his table, his loud voice boasting about a deal in London. Miss Marple took a seat nearby, ordering a cup of tea. She watched him, noting how he glanced at Mr. Thomas, who was nursing a pint in the corner. Sally brought her tea and Miss Marple leaned in. Has Mr. Baxter been asking about the will again? She said softly. Sally nodded, her voice low. All morning. He was talking to that man in the hat last night. They were outside by the alley. I heard him say something about getting it before it's filed. Sounded sneaky. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Did you see the man's face? No, too dark, Sally said. But he was tall, and that hat was pulled low. Left quick when he saw me. Miss Marple thanked her and sipped her tea, her eyes on Mr. Baxter. He was meeting the stranger, talking about the will. Was he after Grayson's money or working with someone else? She needed to know more. She left the inn and headed to the butcher's shop where Mr. Thomas was wiping down his counter, his face dark. Good afternoon, Mr. Thomas, Miss Marple said, her voice bright. I'll take some chops, please. I was thinking about Mr. Grayson's accounts. Did he ever mention a discrepancy to you? Mr. Thomas's hands stopped and his eyes narrowed. Discrepancy? He was always harping on about money. Said I owed him, but I didn't. He was wrong. His voice was sharp, and he chopped the meat with force. Miss Marple nodded, watching him. Did he mention a meeting that night? Maybe about his will? No. Mr. Thomas snapped. I was here working. Ask anyone. He wrapped the chops, his hands rough. Miss Marple paid and left, her mind turning over his words. His alibi was steady, but his anger was raw. Was tea in the ledger him or someone else? She walked to the village green where Tommy was skipping stones by the pond. "Tommy," she called, "found anything new?" He grinned, pulling a small muddy handkerchief from his pocket. "This was by the pond near where I got the key. It's got a letter on it. Looks like an R." Miss Marple's heart skipped. "Another R?" She took the handkerchief, its corner embroidered, with a faint R. "You're a wonder, Tommy," she said, tucking it into her purse. The cufflink, the coin, the ledger, and now the handkerchief, all tied to R. She needed to find out who it was. She visited Dolly Bantry next, hoping for more on the missing letter. The manor house was quiet, its lawn slick with fog. Dolly was in the drawing room sorting papers. "Jane," she said, waving her in. "You're out in this weather? Chasing clues, I bet." Miss Marple laughed. "Just visiting, Dolly. But I did wonder, any news on that letter from Grayson's lawyer?" Dolly frowned. "Still gone. The Colonel's sure it was about the will. He heard Grayson mention a meeting with someone named Robert last month. Could that be your R?" Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Robert? A name at last. "Maybe," she said. "Did the Colonel see the stranger again?" "Yes, last night by the gate," Dolly said. "Tall, hat pulled low. He's sure it's the same man." Miss Marple thanked her and headed home, her thoughts swirling. The locked room, the key, the ledger, the R, it all pointed to a will and a killer. That evening, she attended a small church meeting, watching the crowd. Clara was there, her face pale, clutching a scarf. Mr. Baxter was loud, asking about Grayson's lawyer. Mr. Thomas sat silently, his eyes dark. Mrs. Carter slipped out early, her bag clutched tight. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking. She added the handkerchief and the name Robert to her notebook. The locked room riddle was clearer now. Someone had taken the key, entered the office, and maybe seen the will. The killer was close, hiding among familiar faces. The fog thickened outside, but Miss Marple's mind was sharp, piecing together the puzzle. The murderer thought they were safe, but she was closing in, one quiet clue at a time. Chapter 8. A Clue in the Garden. The 8th day after Mr. Grayson's murder wrapped St. Mary Mead in a soft, damp haze, the kind that blurred the edges of the thatched cottages and made the cobblestone lanes glisten like polished glass. The village was quiet, its usual hum of chatter and footsteps dulled by the fog and the lingering shock of the crime. The air carried the scent of wet grass and fading lavender, a gentle sweetness undercut by the chill of unease. Miss Jane Marple sat at her cottage window, her tea cooling in a delicate cup, her knitting idle on the table. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the misty village green, but her mind was busy, weaving through the clues she'd gathered: the stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions about the will, Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the button, the cufflink with an R, the torn letter, the missing letter from the manor, the scrap of fabric, the coin with an R, the church key, the ledger's note about a $50 discrepancy and a suspect T, and the ledger's mention of a meeting with R about the will. Yesterday's discovery of the embroidered handkerchief with an R and the name Robert from Dolly Bantry had sharpened the puzzle. Today, Miss Marple felt a new clue would surface, and she was ready to find it. The locked room in the church office was a riddle that nagged at her. The key found in the pond suggested someone had entered, perhaps to steal or hide the will. The ledger's entries pointed to missing money and a mysterious R, possibly Robert, who Grayson had met before his death. The stranger in the hat was a constant shadow, seen everywhere: church, pond, shop, manor, and Clara's fear hinted at a connection. Mr. Baxter's obsession with the will and Mr. Thomas's temper made them suspects, but so did Mrs. Bell's secrecy and Mrs. Carter's odd behavior. Miss Marple knew the truth lay in the village's quiet moments, in the slip of a word or the flicker of an eye. She stood, pulling on her coat and a neat hat with a small flower, her walking stick in hand. Today, she would visit the vicarage garden where Clara spent much of her time, hoping to catch her alone and find something new. The high street was hushed, the fog softening the outlines of the bakery and Mrs. Carter's shop. People moved quickly, their heads down as if avoiding the weight of the murder. Miss Marple headed to the vicarage, her stick tapping the slick stones. The garden was a tangle of roses and ivy, damp from the fog, and she saw Clara there, kneeling by a flower bed, her hands busy with a trowel. Miss Marple approached, her voice gentle. "Good morning, Clara," she said. "Your roses are lovely, even in this weather." Clara started, her pale face turning to Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you." Her hands shook and she dropped the trowel, her eyes darting to the vicarage windows. Miss Marple smiled, leaning on her stick. "Gardening's a comfort, isn't it? With all this sadness about Mr. Grayson, it helps to keep busy. Did you ever see him in the churchyard working late?" Clara's eyes widened and she shook her head quickly. "No, I stayed away from the church. I don't like it there." Her voice was high and she picked up the trowel, digging nervously. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the garden. "It's a quiet spot, the churchyard. But someone was there that night. Maybe the man you saw watching the house?" Clara's hands froze and she looked away. "I told you I didn't see much, just a shadow. Please, I don't know anything." Her voice trembled and she stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. Miss Marple didn't push. "Of course, dear. If you ever want to talk, my cottage is open." She turned to leave, but her eyes caught something in the flower bed, a glint of metal half buried in the soil. She bent closer, pretending to admire a rose, and saw a small silver pen, its tip engraved with an R. Her heart quickened, but she kept her face calm. "What a pretty garden," she said, slipping the pen into her purse when Clara looked away. "I'll let you get back to it." Clara nodded, her face pale, and hurried inside. Miss Marple walked away, her mind racing. Another R? The cufflink, the coin, the handkerchief, and now a pen, all tied to this mysterious initial. Was Clara hiding it, or had someone else left it in the garden? She needed to know more about Clara's past and her connection to the bells. Her next stop was the Rose and Crown Inn, where Mr. Baxter was likely stirring trouble. The inn was warm, the fog kept at bay by a roaring fire. Mr. Baxter sat at his usual table, his loud voice boasting about a deal for antique silver. Miss Marple took a seat nearby, ordering a glass of lemonade. She watched him, noting how his eyes flicked to the door, as if expecting someone. Sally, the barmaid, brought her drink and Miss Marple smiled. "Mr. Baxter's full of stories," she said. "Has he been asking about the will again?" Sally nodded, her voice low. "Nonstop. Last night he was talking to Mr. Thomas about, it said he heard Grayson left money to someone outside the village. They got quiet when I came near." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Outside the village? Did he say who?" "No, but he mentioned a name." "Robert something," Sally said. Sounded like he knew more than he let on. Miss Marple thanked her and sipped her lemonade, her eyes on Mr. Baxter. Robert again, the same name Dolly had mentioned. Was he the R in the ledger, the cufflink, the coin, the handkerchief, and the pen? She needed to know who he was, and why Mr. Baxter was so interested. She left the inn and headed to the butcher's shop where Mr. Thomas was chopping meat, his face red and his movements sharp. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thomas," Miss Marple said, her voice bright. "I'll take some bacon, please. I was thinking about Mr. Grayson's will. Did he ever mention leaving money to someone named Robert?" Mr. Thomas's knife paused, and his eyes narrowed. "Robert? No, he never said anything like that." "Why, would he tell me?" He was always on about the church money, not his own. His voice was gruff, and he slammed the knife down. Miss Marple nodded, watching his hands. "Of course, but with the ledger showing missing money, I thought he might have shared something." Mr. Thomas's face darkened. "Ledger? I don't know about any ledger. I paid my share for the fete. He was wrong to accuse me." He wrapped the bacon, his hands rough. Miss Marple paid and left, her mind turning over his words. The ledger's tea was likely him, and his anger was too raw to be innocent. She walked to the village green where Tommy was tossing pebbles into the pond. "Tommy," she called, "any more fines?" He grinned, pulling a small, muddy notebook from his pocket. Found this near the pond by the reeds. It's got writing, but it's smudged. He handed it to her, its cover worn but a faint R visible in the corner. Miss Marple's heart skipped. Another R? She flipped through the notebook, finding a few legible words. Meet Grayson, church, will. The rest was blurred by water. You're a gem, Tommy, she said, tucking it into her purse. The notebook was another link to the will and the mysterious R. She visited Dolly Bantry next, hoping for more on the name Robert. The manor house was quiet, its lawn damp and gray. Dolly was in the parlor, sorting letters. Jane, she said, waving her in. You're out in this fog, sleuthing, I bet. Miss Marple laughed. Just visiting, Dolly. But I did wonder, you mentioned Robert. Did Grayson ever say more about him? Dolly frowned, thinking. Not much, but the colonel heard Grayson mention a Robert Langley, a nephew or something from London. Said he was coming to visit soon. Could that be your R? Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Robert Langley. A name at last. Maybe, she said. Any sign of that missing letter? Still gone, Dolly said. But the colonel saw that man in the hat again near the church last night. Tall, sneaky, hat pulled low. Miss Marple thanked her and headed home, her thoughts swirling. Robert Langley, the will, the stranger. All connected. That evening, she attended a small gathering at the church hall, watching the crowd. Clara was there, her face pale, clutching a shawl. Mr. Baxter was loud, asking about Grayson's family. Mr. Thomas sat silently, his eyes dark. Mrs. Carter was nervous, her hands fidgeting with her bag. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking. She added the pen and notebook to her notebook along with the name Robert Langley. The garden clue, the R items, the ledger, each pointed to a killer tied to the will. The village slept under the fog, but Miss Marple's mind was clear, piecing together the puzzle. The murderer was close, but she was closer and she wouldn't stop until the truth was out. Chapter 9. The Stranger's Alibi. The 9th day after Mr. Grayson's murder draped St. Mary Mead in a restless quiet, the kind that follows a storm but promises another. The fog had lifted, leaving a crisp morning with a sky pale as old linen. The village lanes, still damp from yesterday's rain, sparkled faintly under the sun, and the air carried the sharp scent of wet grass and chimney smoke. Miss Jane Marple sat at her cottage window, her tea steaming in a delicate cup, her knitting untouched on the table. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the village green, but her mind was weaving through the clues she'd gathered. The stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions about the will, Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the button, the cufflink with an R, the torn letter, the missing letter from the manor, the scrap of fabric, the coin with an R, the church, key, the ledger's note about a $50 discrepancy and a suspect T, the ledger's mention of a meeting with R about the will, the handkerchief with an R, the silver pen from the vicarage garden, and the smudged notebook with words about meeting Grayson. The name Robert Langley, mentioned by Dolly Bantry as Grayson's possible nephew, had sharpened the puzzle. Today, Miss Marple was determined to track down the stranger and test his alibi, for he was the shadow at the heart of the mystery. The stranger in the hat had been seen everywhere, by the church, the pond, the shop, the manor, and his presence tied to the R clues. Was he Robert Langley, the nephew Grayson planned to meet? And why was Clara so afraid of him? Miss Marple knew the will was the key. Someone had killed Grayson to control its contents, and the stranger's sneaky movements suggested he knew more than he let on. She stood, pulling on her coat and a neat hat with a small feather, her walking stick ready. Her plan was to start at the Rose and Crown Inn, where the stranger had been spotted with Mr. Baxter, then visit the vicarage to probe Clara further. The killer was hiding in plain sight, and Miss Marple was closing in. The high street was stirring, but the village felt tense like a spring wound too tight. People nodded politely, their eyes wary, as if the murder had made everyone a suspect. Miss Marple headed to the inn first, its windows glowing with morning light. The air inside smelled of coffee and fresh bread, and the chatter was quieter than usual. Mr. Baxter sat at his usual table, his red face buried in a newspaper, but his eyes flicked to the door every few seconds. Miss Marple took a seat nearby, ordering a cup of tea. Sally, the barmaid, brought it, and Miss Marple smiled. "Good morning, Sally," she said. "I hear Mr. Baxter's been meeting a stranger lately. The tall man with the hat?" Sally nodded, her voice low. "Saw them again last night outside by the stables. They were arguing something about papers. The man in the hat said, 'It's done, leave it alone.' Sounded angry." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Did you hear a name?" "Robert, perhaps?" Sally frowned, thinking. "Might have been. Mr. Baxter called him something like that. They stopped talking when they saw me." Miss Marple thanked her and sipped her tea, her eyes on Mr. Baxter. He was nervous today, his fingers tapping the table. Was he working with the stranger, or afraid of him? She needed to find this man and hear his alibi. She left the inn and headed to the vicarage, her stick tapping the damp stones. The garden was quiet, the roses heavy with dew. Mrs. Bell answered the door, her face pale and her hands clutching a dishcloth. "Jane, what a surprise," Mrs. Bell said, her smile forced. "Clara's out, I'm afraid. She went for a walk." Miss Marple nodded, her tone gentle. "That's all right. I was just thinking about Mr. Grayson's nephew, Robert Langley. Did he ever visit the church?" Mrs. Bell's eyes widened and she gripped the cloth tighter. "Robert? I don't know him. Grayson never mentioned a nephew." Her voice was too quick and she stepped back. Miss Marple smiled, watching her closely. "Just village gossip. I heard he might be in town, a tall man with a hat. Clara mentioned seeing someone like that, didn't she?" Mrs. Bell's face went white. "Clara's mistaken. She's nervous, that's all. Excuse me, I have chores." She closed the door, leaving Miss Marple on the step. Miss Marple's mind raced. Mrs. Bell's fear was real, and it was tied to Robert Langley. She walked toward the church, hoping to find Clara nearby. The churchyard was empty, but as she passed the yew tree, she saw a fresh clue, a cigarette stub half buried in the mud near the shoe mark. It was a fancy brand, not common in the village, with a faint R on the filter. Her pulse quickened and she slipped it into her purse beside the cufflink, coin, handkerchief, pen, and notebook. Another R. The stranger was careless, or bold. Inside the church, Mr. Bell was sweeping the aisle, his face tired. Miss Marple approached, her voice warm. "Good morning, Mr. Bell. I was thinking about the office key. Did Mr. Grayson ever mention losing it?" Mr. Bell paused, his broom still. "No, he was careful with it. Said it was always in his pocket. I don't know how it ended up in the pond." His eyes darted to the vestry. Miss Marple nodded. "And this Robert Langley, Grayson's nephew, did he ever come to the church?" Mr. Bell's hands tightened on the broom. "Nephew? I never heard of him. Grayson kept to himself about family." His voice was shaky, and he turned away. "Missy," Marple didn't push. The Bells were hiding something, and it was tied to Clara and possibly Robert. She left the church and headed to the village green, where she spotted Clara sitting by the pond, her face pale and her hands twisting a scarf. Miss Marple approached, her smile gentle. "Clara, dear, it's nice to see you out. Mind if I sit?" Clara nodded, her eyes nervous. Fine." She glanced around as if expecting someone to appear. Miss Marple sat, her stick resting on her knee. "This murder's got everyone jumpy. I hear Mr. Grayson had a nephew, Robert. Did you ever see him, maybe the man in the hat?" Clara's breath caught and she stood quickly. "I don't know any Robert. I told you I just saw a shadow. Please leave me alone." She hurried away, her scarf slipping to the ground. Miss Marple picked it up, her eyes sharp. The scarf had a faint R embroidered in the corner, matching the handkerchief. She tucked it into her purse, her mind racing. Clara was terrified, and the R clues were piling up. Was she running from Robert Langley, or protecting him? Miss Marple needed to find the stranger and hear his story. She headed to the butcher's shop where Mr. Thomas was cleaning his knives, his face red. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thomas," she said. "I'll take some sausages. I was wondering, did Mr. Grayson ever mention a nephew named Robert?" Mr. Thomas's knife paused and his eyes narrowed. "No, and I wouldn't care if he did. Grayson was a pain, always accusing me of things. I was here that night working." His voice was sharp and he slammed the knife down. Miss Marple nodded, watching him. "Of course. Did you ever see a stranger around, tall with a hat?" "No," he snapped. "I don't notice every wanderer." He wrapped the sausages, his hands rough. Miss Marple paid and left, her mind turning over his words. His alibi was firm, but his temper was aflare. She visited Dolly Bantry next, hoping for more on Robert Langley. The manor house was quiet, its lawn damp. Dolly was in the parlor reading a letter. "Jane," she said, waving her in. "You're out sleuthing, aren't you?" Miss Marple laughed. "Just visiting, Dolly. But you mentioned Robert Langley. Any more details about him?" Dolly frowned. "The colonel said Grayson talked about him once, said he was a bit of a rogue, always needing money. Might have been coming to St. Mary Mead to settle a debt." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "A debt? That could be motive." "And the missing letter?" she asked. "Still gone," Dolly said. "But the colonel saw that man in the hat again, near the church last night. Thinks he's up to no good." Miss Marple thanked her and headed home, her thoughts swirling. Robert Langley, a nephew needing money, tied to the will and the R clues. That evening she heard a rumor at the church hall. A stranger had been seen leaving the village, but no one knew his name. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting, needles clicking, adding the cigarette stub and scarf to her notebook. The stranger's alibi was shaky, and the R clues pointed to him. The village slept, but Miss Marple's mind was awake, piecing together the puzzle. The killer was close, and she was closer, one quiet clue at a time. Chapter 10. Letters from the Past. The 10th day after Mr. Grayson's murder greeted St. Mary Mead with a pale, watery sun that barely warmed the chilly air. The village, nestled in its quiet valley, seemed to hold its breath. The cobblestone, lanes slick from last night's drizzle, and the thatched cottages huddled under a sky streaked with thin clouds. The scent of damp earth and fading roses lingered, mingling with the faint smoke from morning fires. Miss Jane Marple sat at her cottage window, her tea cooling in a delicate cup, her knitting untouched on the table. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the village green, where children played half-heartedly by the duck pond. But her mind was busy, weaving through the growing tangle of clues. The stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions about the will, Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the button, the cufflink with an R, the torn letter, the missing letter from the manor, the scrap of fabric, the coin with an R, the church key, the ledger's note about a $50 discrepancy and a suspect T, the ledger's mention of a meeting with R about the will, the handkerchief with an R, the silver pen from the vicarage garden, the smudged notebook, and the cigarette stub with an R, Dolly Bantry's mention of Robert Langley, Grayson's nephew with a reputation as a rogue, had sharpened the puzzle, and the stranger's argument with Mr. Baxter about papers suggested a deeper plot. Today, Miss Marple was determined to uncover something new, something from Grayson's past that might explain the murder. The stranger's alibi was flimsy, tied to fleeting sightings and whispers of a name, Robert Langley. Was he the R on the cufflink, coin, handkerchief, pen, notebook, and cigarette stub? Clara's fear seemed to center on him, and the bell's secrecy only deepened the mystery. The will, with its hinted changes, was the key, and Miss Marple suspected it held secrets Grayson had died to protect or expose. She stood pulling on her coat and a simple hat with a small ribbon, her walking stick ready. Her plan was to visit the church again, then call on Mrs. Carter, who might know more about Grayson's past. But first she'd stop by the manor to see if Dolly had uncovered anything new about the missing letter or Robert Langley. The high street was quiet, the village still shaken by the murder. People moved quickly, their faces drawn, as if afraid, to linger. Miss Marple headed to the manor house, its tall windows catching the weak sunlight. Dolly Bantry was in the garden, pruning roses despite the chill. "Jane," she called, brushing dirt from her hands. "You're out early. Chasing clues, I bet." Miss Marple smiled, leaning on her stick. "Just a morning walk, Dolly. But I was wondering, have you found anything more about that missing letter from Grayson's lawyer? Or about Robert Langley?" Dolly's eyes lit up. "The letter's still gone, but the colonel found something odd in the study yesterday. An old box of Grayson's papers tucked behind some books. We didn't even know it was there. It's got letters, Jane, from years ago. One mentions a falling out with a relative, someone named Robert. Could that be your man?" Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Letters? That's interesting. Could I see them?" Dolly nodded, leading her inside to the study. The box was small, dusty, and filled with yellowed envelopes. Miss Marple sifted through them, her fingers careful. One letter, dated 10 years ago, caught her eye. It was from Grayson to a Robert Langley, written in a sharp, angry hand. "Your debts disgrace the family. I'll not help again unless you change." Another letter from Robert to Grayson was pleading. "I need your help, Uncle. One last time." Miss Marple tucked the letters into her purse, promising to return them. "These could be important, Dolly," she said. "Did the colonel see the stranger again?" "Yes, near the church 2 nights ago," Dolly said. "Tall, hat pulled low, moving fast. He's sure it's the same man." Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the church, her mind racing. The letters painted a picture of a strained relationship between Grayson and Robert Langley, likely the R in the clues. Had Robert come to St. Mary Mead to settle a debt or a grudge? The church was quiet, its stone walls cool and damp. Mr. Bell was polishing the altar, his face tired. Miss Marple approached, her voice gentle. "Good morning, Mr. Bell. I was thinking about Mr. Grayson's family. Did he ever mention a nephew, Robert Langley?" Mr. Bell's hands froze and he dropped the cloth. "Robert? No, he never spoke of family. Why do you ask?" His voice was shaky, and his eyes darted to the vestry. Miss Marple nodded, watching him closely. "Just village talk. I heard he might have visited recently. Perhaps he came to the church?" Mr. Bell shook his head quickly. "No one like that. Grayson was private." He turned back to the altar, his shoulders stiff. Miss Marple didn't push. Mr. Bell's nerves were telling, and she suspected he knew more about Robert than he admitted. She slipped into the vestry, checking the office door. It was locked, but her key still worked. Inside, she found a small overlooked envelope under the desk, sealed with wax and addressed to R. Langley. Her pulse quickened. She tucked it into her purse, locking the door behind her. The envelope was heavy, perhaps a copy of the will. She'd open it later in private. She headed to the vicarage, hoping to catch Clara. The garden was empty, but Mrs. Bell answered the door, her face pale. "Jane, Clara's out," she said quickly. "She's been unwell." Miss Marple smiled, her tone kind. "I'm sorry to hear that. I was thinking about Mr. Grayson's nephew, Robert. Did Clara ever mention meeting him?" Mrs. Bell's hands gripped the doorframe. "Robert? No, she doesn't know him. Why would she?" Her voice was sharp, and she closed the door before Miss Marple could reply. Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Mrs. Bell's fear was tied to Robert Langley, and Clara's absence felt deliberate. She walked to Mrs. Carter's shop, the bell jingling, as she entered. Mrs. Carter was behind the counter, her face flushed. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said. "Tea or thread today?" "Just a chat," Miss Marple said, leaning on her stick. "I was thinking about Mr. Grayson's past. Did he ever mention a nephew, Robert Langley?" Mrs. Carter's hands paused on a jar of sweets. "Robert? I heard him mention a nephew years ago, said he was trouble, always asking for money. Grayson wasn't kind about him." She lowered her voice. "I saw a stranger in here last week, tall with a hat. Asked about Grayson's house. Could that be him?" Miss Marple's heart skipped. "Perhaps. Did he say anything else?" "No, just bought matches and left," Mrs. Carter said. "But he gave me the creeps." Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the Rose and Crown Inn, where Mr. Baxter was likely stirring gossip. The inn was warm, the air thick with the smell of ale and roasted meat. Mr. Baxter sat at his table, his loud voice boasting about a deal in Bristol. Miss Marple took a seat, nearby, ordering a glass of sherry. Sally brought it, and Miss Marple smiled. "Has Mr. Baxter been talking about Robert Langley?" she asked softly. Sally nodded, her voice low. "Last night he was asking Mr. Thomas about him. Said he heard Robert was in town, looking for Grayson's money. They got quiet when I came near." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Did you see the stranger again?" "Yes, outside the inn yesterday," Sally said. "Tall hat pulled low. He was with Mr. Baxter talking about a letter." Miss Marple thanked her and sipped her sherry, her eyes on Mr. Baxter. He was too involved, meeting the stranger and asking about Robert. Was he working with him or using him? She left the inn and headed to the butcher's shop, where Mr. Thomas was cleaning his counter, his face dark. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thomas," Miss Marple said. "I'll take some chops." "Did Mr. Grayson ever mention his nephew, Robert Langley?" Mr. Thomas's knife stopped and his eyes narrowed. "No, and I wouldn't care if he did. Grayson was always trouble, accusing me of stealing. I was here, that night, working." His voice was sharp and he slammed the knife down. Miss Marple nodded, watching him. "Of course. Did you see a stranger around, tall with a hat?" "No," he snapped. "I don't watch every passerby." He rapped the chops, his hands rough. Miss Marple paid and left, her mind racing. Mr. Thomas's anger was a flare, and his alibi was too pat. She walked to the village green where Tommy was skipping stones. "Tommy," she called, "any new finds?" He grinned, pulling a small, crumpled photo from his pocket. "Found this by the pond, near where I got the notebook. It's old, shows a man and a boy. The photo was faded, but the man looked like Grayson and the boy had an R on his jacket." Miss Marple's heart skipped. "You're a star, Tommy," she said, tucking the photo into her purse. The boy could be Robert years ago. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, opening the envelope from the church. It was a draft of Grayson's will, naming Robert Langley as a beneficiary, but with a note. To be revised, debts unpaid. Her knitting needles clicked as she added the letters, envelope, and photo to her notebook. The past was speaking, and the killer was close. The village slept, but Miss Marple's mind was awake, piecing together the puzzle, one quiet clue at a time. Chapter 11. The Nighttime Confession. The 11th day after Mr. Grayson's murder cloaked St. Mary Mead in a restless hush, the kind that settles before a storm breaks. The sun had set, leaving a sky pricked with stars and a cool breeze that rustled the leaves along the village lanes. The scent of damp grass and wood smoke drifted through the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of late roses. Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage fire, the soft glow casting shadows on the walls. Her tea cold in its cup and her knitting idle on the table, her sharp blue eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond her window. But her mind was alive, weaving through the intricate web of clues she'd gathered. The stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions about the will, Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the button, the cufflink with an R, the torn letter, the missing letter from the manor, the scrap of fabric, the coin with an R, the church key, the ledger's note about a $50 discrepancy and a suspect T, the ledger's mention of a meeting with R about the will, the handkerchief with an R, the silver pen from the vicarage garden, the smudged notebook, the cigarette stub with an R, the old letters revealing Grayson's feud with Robert Langley, the draft will naming Langley as a beneficiary, and the faded photo of Grayson with a boy marked R. The stranger, likely Robert Langley, was at the heart of the mystery, but his alibi was shaky, and Clara's fear suggested she knew more than she let on. Tonight, Miss Marple sensed something would shift, a confession, perhaps, that would bring the killer into focus. The old letters had painted a picture of Robert Langley as a wayward nephew, burdened by debts and cut off by Grayson years ago. The draft will, found in the church office, showed Grayson reconsidering his inheritance, but with a note to revise it due to unpaid debts. Had Langley killed to secure the money, or to stop the will from changing? Clara's terror and the bells. Secrecy hinted at a connection, and Mr. Baxter's meetings with the stranger suggested he was after the will's secrets. Mr. Thomas's temper and the ledger's tea kept him in the frame, but Miss Marple felt the truth was closer to Robert and Clara. She stood pulling on her shawl and a dark hat, her walking stick ready. Tonight she'd visit the vicarage under the guise of returning a borrowed book, hoping to catch Clara alone and coax out her story. The village was asleep, but secrets never slept, and Miss Marple was ready to uncover them. The lanes were quiet, the only sound the soft tap of her stick on the cobblestones. The vicarage loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly through the ivy. Miss Marple knocked softly, clutching the book, a slim volume of hymns as her excuse. Mrs. Bell opened the door, her face pale and her eyes red, as if she'd been crying. "Jane, it's late," she said, her voice trembling. "Is something wrong?" "I'm sorry to bother you, Lucy," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "I just wanted to return your book. Is Clara awake? I'd love to say hello." Mrs. Bell hesitated, her hands twisting her apron. "Clara's not feeling well. She's in her room. Maybe tomorrow?" Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes caught a flicker of movement behind Mrs. Bell. Clara, standing at the top of the stairs, her face ghostly in the dim light. "Clara, dear," Miss Marple called softly. "I won't keep you. Just a quick word?" Clara froze, her hands gripping the banister. Mrs. Bell turned, her voice sharp. "Clara, go back to bed." But Clara shook her head, her eyes wide with fear, and came down the stairs, her steps unsteady. "I can't do this anymore," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "I need to tell someone." Mrs. Bell gasped, reaching for her. "Clara, no, it's not safe." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her voice calm. "It's all right, dear. You're safe with me. What do you need to say?" Clara sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "It's about Robert," she said, her voice barely audible. "Robert Langley. He's my brother. He came to St. Mary Mead to see Uncle Grayson about the will. I told him not to, but he wouldn't listen." Miss Marple's mind raced. Clara and Robert? Siblings? That explained her fear and the Bell's secrecy. "Your brother?" she said gently. "Was he the man in the hat watching the vicarage?" Clara nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He was angry with Uncle Grayson. They fought years ago over money. Robert owed debts and Uncle cut him off. When he heard Uncle was changing the will, he came to talk him out of it. But I swear he didn't kill him. He was with me that night at the vicarage. We were talking in the garden." Mrs. Bell sank into a chair, her face in her hands. "I told her to stay quiet," she said. "Robert's a good boy, but he's in trouble. We thought if anyone knew he was here, they'd blame him." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes sharp. "Eyes. Clara, why was Robert so worried about the will?" Clara wiped her eyes. "Uncle was going to leave everything to the church to make up for some old mistake. Robert needed the money to pay his debts. He said he just wanted to talk. But they argued in the churchyard. Robert left before it happened. I saw him go." Miss Marple's mind turned over the confession. Robert's alibi was Clara's word, but it explained the R clues: cufflink, coin, handkerchief, pen, notebook, cigarette stub, and photo. "Did Robert drop anything in the churchyard?" she asked. "A pen, perhaps, or a cigarette?" Clara nodded. "He smokes those fancy ones. And he lost his pen, the one with his initial. He was so upset, said it was a gift." Miss Marple filed the details away. "Thank you, Clara. You've been very brave. One last thing, did you see anyone else in the churchyard that night?" Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering. I thought I saw someone by the yew tree, just a shadow. It wasn't Robert. It was after he left." Mrs. Bell stood, her voice firm. "That's enough, Clara. You need rest. Jane, please, don't tell anyone yet. Robert's not safe." Miss Marple nodded, her smile kind. "I'll be careful, Lucy. Thank you, Clara." She left the vicarage, her mind buzzing. Clara's confession had shifted the puzzle. Robert Langley was in St. Mary Mead, tied to the will, but Clara swore he wasn't the killer. The shadow by the yew tree was a new clue suggesting someone else was there when Grayson died. She walked home, the village dark and silent. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, pulling out her notebook. She added Clara's confession, Robert's alibi, and the shadow by the yew tree. The R clues fit Robert, but the shoe mark, button, and scrap of fabric didn't. Who was the shadow? She needed to check Robert's story and find out who else had a motive. The next morning, she headed to the Rose and Crown Inn, where Mr. Baxter was likely gossiping. The inn was quiet, the air heavy with the smell of coffee. Mr. Baxter sat at his table, his face pale as if he hadn't slept. Miss Marple took a seat nearby, ordering tea. Sally brought it, and Miss Marple leaned in. "Has Mr. Baxter been meeting the stranger lately?" she asked softly. Sally nodded, her voice low. "Last night outside again. They were arguing about money. The man in the hat said, 'You'll get your share, but keep quiet.' Sounded like a deal." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Did you hear a name?" "Think it was Robert," Sally said. "Mr. Baxter called him that." Miss Marple thanked her and sipped her tea, her eyes on Mr. Baxter. He was nervous, his hands fidgeting. Was he working with Robert or blackmailing him? She left the inn and headed to the butcher's shop where Mr. Thomas was chopping meat, his face red. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas," Miss Marple said. "I'll take some bacon." "Did you ever hear Mr. Grayson mention his nephew, Robert Langley?" Mr. Thomas's knife paused and his eyes narrowed. "No, and I didn't care about his family. He was always accusing me of stealing. I was here that night, working." His voice was sharp, and he slammed the knife down. Miss Marple nodded, watching him. "Did you see anyone by the church that night? A shadow, maybe?" "No," he snapped. "I was busy." He wrapped the bacon, his hands rough. Miss Marple paid and left, her mind racing. Mr. Thomas's alibi was steady, but his anger was a flare. She visited Mrs. Carter's shop next, the bell jingling as she entered. Mrs. Carter was pale, her hands fidgeting. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said. "What's it today?" "Just a chat," Miss Marple said. "Did you ever see Robert Langley in the village? Or a stranger by the church that night?" Mrs. Carter's hand stopped. "I saw that man with the hat like I told you. Never heard of Robert. But that night, I saw someone by the yew tree, just a shape in the dark. Scared me silly." She lowered her voice. "Could have been anyone." Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the village green where Tommy was tossing pebbles. "Tommy," she called, "any new finds?" He grinned, pulling a small, muddy ring from his pocket. "Found this by the pond, near where I got the photo. It's got an R inside." The ring was simple, with a faint R engraved. Miss Marple's heart skipped. "You're a wonder, Tommy," she said, tucking it into her purse. Another R, Robert's or someone else's. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking. She added the ring and Clara's confession to her notebook. The shadow by the yew tree was the key. Someone else was there when Grayson died. Robert's alibi was shaky, but the real killer was closer, hiding behind the R clues. The village slept, but Miss Marple's mind was awake, piecing together the puzzle, one quiet clue at a time. Chapter 12. The Final Thread. The 12th day after Mr. Grayson's murder dawned with a fragile calm over St. Mary Mead, as if the village were exhaling after weeks of holding its breath. A soft sun broke through the morning clouds, casting golden light on the cobblestone lanes and thatched cottages, warming the air with the scent of fresh grass and blooming honeysuckle. The duck pond sparkled, and children's laughter echoed faintly, a sign of life returning. But beneath the surface, tension lingered, a quiet hum of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Miss Jane Marple sat at her cottage window, her tea steaming in a delicate cup, her knitting resting on the table. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the village green, but her mind was a busy loom, weaving the final threads of the mystery that had gripped St. Mary Mead, the stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions about the will, Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the button, the cufflink with an R, the torn letter, the missing letter from the manor, the scrap of fabric, the coin with an R, the church. Key, the ledger's note about a $50 discrepancy and a suspect T, the ledger's mention of a meeting with R about the will, the handkerchief with an R, the silver pen from the vicarage garden, the smudged notebook, the cigarette stub with an R, the old letters revealing Grayson's feud with Robert Langley, the draft will naming Langley as a beneficiary, the faded photo of Grayson with a boy marked R, and the ring with an R found by the pond. Clara's nighttime confession had confirmed Robert Langley as her brother and the stranger, but she swore he was innocent, pointing to a shadow by the yew tree as the real killer. Today, Miss Marple knew she would unravel the final thread and reveal the murderer. Clara's confession had shifted the puzzle, clearing Robert Langley of the murder but not of suspicion. His presence in the village, driven by debts and the will, explained the R clues: cufflink, coin, handkerchief, pen, notebook, cigarette stub, photo, and ring, but the shoe mark, button, and scrap of fabric pointed elsewhere. The shadow by the yew tree, seen by Clara and Mrs. Carter, was the key. Someone else had been in the churchyard when Grayson died. Someone who struck him down to protect a secret tied to the will or the missing money. Miss Marple suspected the killer was closer than anyone realized, hiding behind a familiar face. She stood, pulling on her coat and a neat hat with a small bow, her walking stick ready. Her plan was to gather the key players, Clara, Mr. Baxter, Mr. Thomas, and Mrs. Bell, at the church hall under the guise of a community meeting, where she'd lay a trap to draw out the truth. The killer was clever, but Miss Marple was cleverer. The cue. High Street was stirring, the village trying to reclaim its rhythm. People nodded to Miss Marple, their smiles cautious, as if sensing the end was near. She stopped by the vicarage first, knocking softly. Mrs. Bell answered, her face pale but composed. "Jane, good morning," she said, her voice steady. "Clara's resting after last night." "I understand," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "I'm hosting a small meeting at the church hall this afternoon to discuss the village's safety. I'd like you and Clara to come. It's important." Mrs. Bell hesitated, then nodded. "We'll be there. Thank you, Jane." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes sharp. "Bring Clara's scarf, the one with the R. It might help clear things up." Mrs. Bell's eyes widened, but she said nothing, closing the door. Next, Miss Marple visited the Rose and Crown Inn, where Mr. Baxter was sipping coffee, his face tense. She approached, her voice bright. "Mr. Baxter, I'm holding a meeting at the church hall today about the murder. Your insights would be valuable. Will you come?" Mr. Baxter's fingers tightened on his cup. "A meeting? Sure, I'll be there. Anything to help." His smile was forced and his eyes flicked to the door. Miss Marple nodded, noting his nerves. She left the inn and headed to the butcher's shop, where Mr. Thomas was sharpening a knife, his face red. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas," she said. "I'm hosting a meeting at the church hall this afternoon about Mr. Grayson's case. I'd like you to attend." Mr. Thomas's knife paused, and his eyes narrowed. "Why me? I've told the police everything. I was here that night working." His voice was sharp and he slammed the knife down. Miss Marple smiled, unfazed. "Just to share your thoughts. It's for the village." He grunted, nodding reluctantly, and she left, her mind turning over his anger. The ledger's T still nagged at her. Thomas was involved, but how? She stopped by Mrs. Carter's shop, inviting her to the meeting as well. Mrs. Carter agreed, her hands fidgeting, and mentioned seeing the stranger again near the church last night. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind sharpening. Robert Langley was still in the village, but the killer was someone else. She returned home, preparing her notes and the clues from her purse: the cufflink, coin, handkerchief, pen, notebook, cigarette stub, ring, button, fabric, and letters. Each would play a part in her plan. That afternoon, the church hall was filled with a small, tense crowd. Clara sat beside Mrs. Bell, her face pale, clutching the scarf with the R. Mr. Baxter was loud, chatting with neighbors, but his eyes were wary. Mr. Thomas stood at the back, his arms crossed, glowering. Mrs. Carter fidgeted near the door, her bag clutched tight. Inspector Slack was there, looking impatient, and Dolly Bantry sat near Miss Marple, whispering gossip. Miss Marple stood, her voice clear but gentle, addressing the room. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "Mr. Grayson's murder has shaken our village, but I believe we're close to the truth. I've gathered some clues, and with your help we can find the killer." The room went silent, eyes fixed on her. She held up the cufflink. "This was found by the pond, marked with an R. So were a coin, a handkerchief, a pen, a notebook, a cigarette stub, and a ring. They belonged to Robert Langley, Mr. Grayson's nephew, who was in St. Mary Mead the night of the murder." Clara gasped, and Mrs. Bell gripped her hand. Mr. Baxter shifted, his face pale. Miss Marple continued, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Robert was here about the will, which Grayson was changing to leave his money to the church. Robert argued with him in the churchyard, but Clara, his sister, says he left before the murder. She saw a shadow by the yew tree, someone else." Inspector Slack frowned, but Miss Marple pressed on, holding up the shoe mark sketch. "This mark, by the yew tree, is deep, from a man's boot. And this button, found near Grayson's body, doesn't match Robert's coat. Neither does this fabric, dark blue and frayed." She paused, her eyes on Mr. Thomas. "The church ledger noted a $50 discrepancy with a suspect T. Mr. Thomas, you argued with Grayson about the fate money. Were you in the churchyard that night?" Mr. Thomas's face reddened, and he stood, his voice loud. "I was at my shop working. You've got no proof." Miss Marple nodded, her voice calm. "Perhaps. But the ledger suggests someone was taking money, and Grayson knew. He was meeting someone about the will that night, someone who didn't want it changed." She turned to Mr. Baxter, holding up the torn letter. "Mr. Baxter, you asked about the will, meeting Robert Langley in secret. Were you after Grayson's money?" Mr. Baxter laughed, but it was shaky. "I'm just a businessman, Miss Marple. I was curious, that's all." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Curious enough to argue with Robert about papers? Or to take this?" She held up the draft will found in the church office. The crowd gasped. Mrs. Carter stood, her voice trembling. "I saw someone by the yew tree that night. It wasn't Robert. It was Mr. Baxter." The room erupted in murmurs, and Mr. Baxter's face went white. "That's nonsense," he shouted. "I was at the inn." Miss Marple shook her head, holding up the button. "This button matches your coat, Mr. Baxter, and this fabric, found by the yew tree, is from your sleeve. You were in the churchyard, weren't you? You knew Grayson was cutting Robert out of the will, leaving the money to the church. You'd been skimming from the church funds, and Grayson was onto you. You followed him that night, saw him argue with Robert, and when Robert left, you struck him down to keep your secret." Mr. Baxter stood, his hands shaking. "You can't prove that, it's all lies." Inspector Slack stepped forward, his voice firm. "We found your coat, Baxter, with a missing button and a torn sleeve. And the church key? It was in your room. At the inn." Mr. Baxter's shoulders slumped, and he sank into his chair, his face gray. "I didn't mean to kill him," he muttered. "He was going to tell everyone about the money. I hit him once." The crowd gasped, and Clara sobbed, clutching Mrs. Bell. Miss Marple sat, her face calm but her heart heavy. "You thought you were safe, Mr. Baxter, but the village sees everything. The button, the fabric, the ledger, they told the truth." Inspector Slack arrested Mr. Baxter, leading him out as the crowd whispered. Clara approached Miss Marple, her eyes wet. "Thank you," she said. "Robert's safe now." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You were brave, Clara. The truth always comes out." Later, at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking. The village was quiet. The mystery solved. The R clues had pointed to Robert, but the button and fabric revealed Baxter, a greedy man undone by small mistakes. She added the final details to her notebook, closing it with a sigh. St. Mary Mead was safe again, but Miss Marple knew secrets never stayed buried long. Her eyes stayed sharp, ready for the next puzzle, as the village slept under the stars. Chapter 13. Echoes of secrets. The 13th day after Mr. Grayson's murder found St. Mary Mead basking in a tentative peace, the kind that follows a storm when the air feels cleaner but the ground is still soft with rain. The morning sun spilled over the village, gilding the thatched cottages and glinting off the duck pond, where ripples caught the light like scattered coins. The scent of fresh bread from the bakery mingled with the earthy tang of autumn leaves, and children's laughter echoed across the green, a sign the village was healing. Miss Jane Marple sat at her cottage window, her tea steaming in a delicate cup, her knitting resting beside a small notebook on the table. Her sharp blue eyes watched Mr. Hodges pedal by with his mailbag, but her mind was busy, turning over the events of the past weeks, the stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions, Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the button, the cufflink with an R, the torn letter, the missing letter from the manor, the scrap of fabric, the coin with an R, the church key, the ledger's note about a $50 discrepancy and a suspect T, the ledger's mention of a meeting with R, the handkerchief with an R, the silver pen, the smudged notebook, the cigarette stub with an R, the old letters, the draft will, the faded photo, and the ring with an R. Clara's confession had cleared her brother Robert Langley, and Mr. Baxter's arrest had closed the case, his confession tying up the clues, the button, the fabric, the stolen key. Yet Miss Marple felt a faint unease, like a loose thread in a finished sweater. Today she sensed a new secret would surface, an echo of the murder that refused to stay buried. Mr. Baxter's arrest had shaken the village, but it also brought relief. The church hall meeting where Miss Marple had laid her trap was the talk of St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Carter told the story to every customer, Mr. Thomas grumbled about nosy old ladies, and Dolly Bantry declared it better than a detective novel. Clara and Robert Langley had kept a low profile, staying at the vicarage with the Bells, and whispers said Robert was planning to leave soon, his debts still a shadow over him. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind lingering on Clara's pale face and Robert's fancy cigarette stubs. The R clues had all pointed to him, but the shadow by the yew tree seen by Clara and Mrs. Carter had led to Baxter. Still, something nagged at her, a detail out of place, a question unanswered. Why had Baxter been so sure he'd get a share of Grayson's money, as he'd told Robert? And what had become of the missing letter from the manor? A knock at the door broke her thoughts. She opened it to find Tommy, the baker's son, his freckled face bright with excitement. "Miss Marple," he said, holding out a small, muddy object. "I found this by the churchyard near where Mr. Grayson was. It's a locket with a picture inside." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her smile was calm. "You're a treasure, Tommy. May I see it?" He handed her a small silver locket, its clasp stiff but intact. She opened it, revealing a faded photo of a young woman, her hair dark and her smile shy. On the back, etched faintly, was the initial E, Miss Marple's. Mind raced E? No one in the case had that initial. "Where exactly did you find it, Tommy?" "By the yew tree in the dirt," he said. "It was half buried, like someone dropped it ages ago." She thanked him, slipping him a penny, and tucked the locket into her purse beside her notebook. The locket was a new clue, an echo of the past that didn't fit Baxter's crime. Was it tied to Grayson's life, or something older? She pulled on her coat and a plain hat with a small feather, her walking stick ready. Her plan was to visit the vicarage where Clara and Robert might shed light on the locket, then check with Dolly Bantry about Grayson's history. The village was awake, but secrets were stirring. The high street was bustling, though the chatter was softer than usual. Mrs. Carter waved from her shop, and Mr. Hodges tipped his cap, but their eyes held a lingering wariness. Miss Marple headed to the vicarage, its garden bright with late roses. Mrs. Bell answered the door, her face tired but less guarded than before. "Jane, good to see you," she said. "Clara's in the parlor, and Robert's packing. Come in." Miss Marple stepped. Inside, the air warm with the scent of tea and lavender. Clara sat by the window, her hands twisting a handkerchief, while Robert lounged in a chair, his suitcase half packed. "Miss Marple?" Clara said, her voice soft. Thank you again. Robert's leaving tomorrow. Robert nodded, his face weary. I owe you, Miss Marple. I'd be in jail if not for you. Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair. I'm glad it's sorted, but I found something curious today. She held up the locket, watching their faces. This was by the churchyard with an E on it. Does it mean anything to you? Clara's eyes widened and she leaned forward. A locket? Let me see. She took it, her fingers trembling. This looks like my mother's. Her name was Elizabeth, E. But how did it get there? Robert frowned, taking the locket. Mother's been gone 10 years. Uncle Grayson kept her things after she died. Maybe he dropped it? Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Elizabeth, Grayson's sister. Was your mother close to your uncle? She asked. Clara nodded. They were, but they argued before she died. Something about money. Uncle never talked about it. Mrs. Bell spoke up, her voice hesitant. Grayson was private about Elizabeth. I remember a locket like that, though. He showed it to me once, said it was a keepsake. Miss Marple filed the details away. Thank you, Clara. Robert. If you think of anything else, let me know. She left the vicarage, her mind buzzing. The locket linked to Elizabeth, Grayson's sister, and possibly the will. Had it been dropped during the murder or long before? She headed to the manor house, where Dolly Bantry was in her drawing room, sorting through old photos. Jane, Dolly said, waving her in. The village is still talking about your triumph. What brings you here? Miss Marple smiled, sitting down. A small matter, Dolly. I found a locket with an E on it, possibly Elizabeth Langley's, Grayson's sister. Did he ever mention her? Dolly's eyes lit up. Elizabeth? Oh yes, she was a sweet woman, died young. Grayson was heartbroken. There was a scandal, though, something about money she lent to a friend that was never repaid. The colonel might know more. Miss Marple's heart quickened. A friend? Any name? Dolly frowned, thinking. I think it was someone local. But it's been years. Oh, and the colonel found a letter in the study yesterday. Not the missing one, but an old one from Elizabeth to Grayson, mentioning a debt and someone called Edwin. Could that be your E? Miss Marple's mind raced. Edwin? Another E. May I see the letter, Dolly? Dolly fetched it from a drawer, a fragile page in faded ink. It read, Dear brother, Edwin's debt is breaking my heart. I gave him the money, but he's vanished. Please help. Miss Marple tucked the letter into her purse, promising to return it. This is helpful, Dolly. Any sign of that man in the hat lately? No, thank goodness, Dolly said. Robert's been quiet since the arrest. Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the church where the air was cool and smelled of wax. Mr. Bell was arranging hymnals, his face calmer now. Miss Marple, he said, the village owes you. What brings you back? A small question, she said, holding up the locket. This was found by the churchyard, marked E. Clara says it was her mother's, Elizabeth. Did Grayson ever mention her or someone named Edwin? Mr. Bell's hands paused and his eyes flickered. Elizabeth? Yes, Grayson spoke of her. Fondly. But Edwin, I don't recall. He was private about family troubles. His voice was too quick and he looked away. Miss Marple nodded, noting his unease. She left the church, her eyes scanning the churchyard. By the yew tree she saw fresh dirt, as if someone had been digging. She knelt, finding a small, tarnished ring, its band engraved with E and M. Her pulse quickened, another clue tied to Elizabeth and perhaps a second initial, M. She tucked it into her purse, her mind racing. The locket, the letter, the ring. Echoes of a past debt that might explain Grayson's murder. She visited Mrs. Carter's shop next, the bell jingling as she entered. Mrs. Carter was pale, her hands fidgeting. Miss Marple, she said, What's it today? A question, Miss Marple said. Did you know Elizabeth Langley, Grayson's sister? Or someone named Edwin, perhaps a friend of hers? Mrs. Carter's face tightened. Elizabeth? I knew her, slightly, sweet woman. Died too young. Edwin. I heard she lent money to an Edwin Morris years ago. He left the village after the scandal. Why? Miss Marple's heart skipped. Edwin Morris. Just tying up loose ends, she said. Did you see anyone by the churchyard recently digging, perhaps? Mrs. Carter shook her head too quickly. No, I've been busy. Her eyes avoided Miss Marple's. Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the Rose and Crown Inn where Mr. Wells was serving lunch. She asked about Edwin Morris, and he frowned. Old Morris? He was trouble. Ran off after borrowing from half the village, including Elizabeth Langley. Haven't seen him in years. Miss Marple nodded, her mind buzzing. Edwin Morris, tied to Elizabeth's debt, might be the E on the locket and ring. Had Grayson's will stirred up this old scandal? She visited Mr. Thomas's butcher shop last, where he was chopping meat, his face red. Miss Marple, he grunted. What now? A quick question, she said. Did you know Edwin Morris years ago? Mr. Thomas's knife paused and his eyes narrowed. Morris? That cheat? He owed everyone, including my father. Left town and good riddance. Why's it matter? Just village history, Miss Marple said, watching his anger. She left, her mind turning over the clues. Edwin Morris, Elizabeth's debtor, was a ghost from the past, but the locket and ring were recent finds. Someone was digging up secrets, perhaps tied to Grayson's money. That evening, Miss Marple invited Clara, Robert, Mrs. Bell, and Dolly to her cottage for tea, hoping to test her theory. The parlor was warm, the fire crackling. She set out scones and poured tea, her eyes watching their faces. I found a locket and a ring, she said, holding them up. They're tied to your mother, Clara, and a man named Edwin Morris. Grayson's. Will might have been about settling her old debts. Does that mean anything to you? Clara's eyes filled with tears. Mother never told us about Morris, but Uncle Grayson said he wanted to make things right for her. Robert frowned. Morris? I heard that name as a kid. Uncle hated him. Mrs. Bell spoke up, her voice soft. Grayson told me once that Elizabeth's money went to Morris, who disappeared. He felt guilty for not stopping it. Dolly leaned forward. The colonel said Morris was seen near Much Benham last year. Could he be back? Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Perhaps. Someone's been digging by the churchyard where I found these, and Mrs. Carter saw a man there last night, though she wouldn't say who. The room fell silent, and Clara's hands shook. You think someone's after Mother's money? Miss Marple nodded. Grayson's will might have named Morris or threatened to expose him. I think he's returned looking for something hidden, maybe proof of his debt. She didn't say more, but her trap was set. The next morning she told Inspector Slack about the locket and ring, suggesting a watch on the churchyard. That night, Slack caught a man digging by the yew tree, Edwin Morris, older but unmistakable, with a letter from Grayson promising to expose his theft unless he repaid Elizabeth's loan. Morris confessed to sneaking back, hoping to find the letter before the will was read, but he hadn't killed Grayson. He'd been in Much Benham that night. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles clicking, adding the locket, ring, and Morris's confession to her notebook. The murder was solved, but the echoes of secrets had revealed one last truth. St. Mary Mead was quiet, but Miss Marple's eyes stayed sharp, ready for the next whisper of trouble. Chapter 14. Whispers in the Lane. The 14th day after Mr. Grayson's murder brought a gentle warmth to St. Mary Mead, as if the village were stretching awake after a long, troubled sleep. The morning sun bathed the cobblestone lanes in soft gold, glinting off the thatched cottages and the duck pond, where ducks glided lazily under a sky dotted with wispy clouds. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and blooming lavender, a sweetness that softened the lingering chill of autumn. Miss Jane Marple sat at her cottage window, her tea steaming in a delicate cup, her knitting resting beside a small notebook on the table. Her sharp blue eyes watched children chase a ball across the village green, but her mind was busy, sifting through the layers of the mystery that had gripped St. Mary Mead. The stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions, Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the button, the cufflink with an R, the torn letter, the missing letter from the manor, the scrap of fabric, the coin with an R, the church key, the ledger's note about a $50 discrepancy and a suspect. T. The ledger's mention of a meeting with R, the handkerchief with an R, the silver pen, the smudged notebook, the cigarette stub with an R, the old letters, the draft will, the faded photo, the ring with an R, the locket with an E, and the ring with E and M. Mr. Baxter's confession had solved the murder, and Edwin Morris's arrest for digging up old secrets had tied up a loose end tied to Elizabeth Langley's past. Yet Miss Marple felt a faint prickle, like a breeze stirring leaves before a storm. Yesterday's discovery of Morris had answered one question, but today, she sensed, a new whisper would emerge, a secret that refused to stay silent. The village was healing, but slowly. Mr. Baxter's arrest had lifted a weight, and the church hall meeting where Miss Marple revealed his guilt was now village legend. Mrs. Carter retold it with flair. Mr. Thomas muttered about interfering spinsters, and Dolly Bantry called it a triumph. Clara and Robert Langley were still at the vicarage, Robert preparing to leave for London to settle his debts, while Clara seemed quieter, her fear replaced by a heavy sadness. The locket and ring, tied to their mother Elizabeth, had stirred. Old memories and Edwin Morris's confession about his unpaid debt to her had closed a chapter. But Miss Marple couldn't shake a nagging thought. Baxter's motive, greed and fear of exposure, felt too neat, and his mention of a share with Robert suggested a deeper plot. Had someone else been involved? Someone who stayed in the shadows? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She opened it to find Tommy, the baker's son, his freckled face alight with excitement. "Miss Marple," he said, holding out a crumpled piece of paper. "I found this in the lane by the church, tucked under a stone. It's got writing, but it's weird." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her smile was calm. "You're a marvel, Tommy. Let's see it." The paper was damp, its ink smudged but legible. Grayson knew too much. The truth is in the box. Beware the watcher. No signature, just a faint sketch of a cross like the one on the church steeple. Her mind raced. A warning? A confession? Where exactly was this, Tommy? "In the lane behind the church, near the wall," he said. "It was hidden like someone didn't want it found." She thanked him, slipping him a penny, and tucked the note into her purse beside the locket and ring. The message was a new clue, an echo of Grayson's murder that hinted at a hidden truth. A box? And who was the watcher? She pulled on her coat, and a simple hat with a tiny ribbon, her walking stick ready. Her plan was to start at the church where the note was found, then visit Clara and Robert to see if they knew about a box. The village was stirring, but whispers were rising. The high street was alive with morning chatter, though eyes still darted nervously. Mrs. Carter waved from her shop, and Mr. Hodges cycled by, his mailbag bouncing, but the village felt on edge, as if sensing trouble wasn't done. Miss Marple headed to the church, its stone tower glowing in the sun. The lane behind it was narrow, shadowed by the church wall, and she found the spot Tommy described. A flat stone by the wall, scuffed as if recently moved. She knelt, her eyes catching a faint scratch on the wall, shaped like a cross, matching the note's sketch. Her pulse quickened. Someone had marked this spot deliberately. She scanned the ground, finding a small broken twig with a thread of gray wool caught on it. She tucked it into her purse, her mind buzzing. The note, the cross, the wool, new pieces of a puzzle. Inside the church, Mr. Bell was polishing the brass candlesticks, his face calm but tired. "Miss Marple," he said, "you've done wonders for the village. What brings you here?" "A small matter," she said, her voice warm. "I heard Mr. Grayson kept a box of papers. Did he ever mention it? Perhaps tied to his sister, Elizabeth?" "Mr." Bell's hands paused and his eyes flickered. "A box? He had one in the office, but it was just church records. After the murder, we gave it to the police. Why?" Miss Marple nodded, watching him closely. "Just curious. Did he ever talk about a watcher Someone he didn't trust? Mr. Bell shook his head too quickly. No, he was private, but he did say once that someone was always watching. The church. I thought he meant Baxter. His voice was shaky and he turned back to the candlesticks. Miss Marple didn't push. Mr. Bell's nerves were telling, and the box was a lead. She left the church and headed to the vicarage where the garden was bright with dew-kissed roses. Mrs. Bell answered the door, her face softer now. "Jane, come in," she said. "Clara's in the parlor and Robert's almost packed." Miss Marple stepped inside, the air warm with the scent of tea. Clara sat by the fire, her hands still, while Robert sorted papers, his face tense. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice gentle. "You've saved us twice now. What's wrong?" Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair. "I found a note today mentioning a box and a watcher tied to your uncle. Did he ever speak of a special box, perhaps with Elizabeth's things?" Clara's eyes widened and she glanced at Robert. "A box? Uncle had one in his study at home, not the church. It was locked, full of old letters. He said it was Mother's, to be opened only if something happened to him." Robert nodded, his voice low. "I saw it once, years ago. He was funny about it, said it held family truths. I thought it was just sentimental." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Is it still at his house?" Mrs. Bell spoke up, her voice hesitant. "The police took most of his things, but I think the box is still there. Clara, you have the key, don't you?" Clara nodded, pulling a small key from her pocket. "He gave it to me before he died." Miss Marple's mind raced. "Clara, would you let me see it? It might explain the note." Clara agreed, and they walked to Grayson's small house, a tidy cottage near the church. Inside, the air was stale, the furniture untouched since the murder. Clara led them to a study, where a wooden box sat on a shelf, its lid carved with an... So she unlocked it, revealing a bundle of letters, a small diary, and a folded document. Miss Marple's eyes fell on the diary, its pages in Elizabeth's neat hand. One entry read, "Edwin betrayed us, but M knows the truth. If I die, Grayson must tell." M again. The rings E and M. She opened the document, a second will, dated a week before Grayson's death, naming Clara as the main heir, with a note, "To right Elizabeth's wrongs, M must be found." Her pulse quickened. M was the watcher? She tucked the diary and will into her purse, promising to return them. "Thank you, Clara," she said. "This is important." They returned to the vicarage, and Miss Marple headed to the manor house where Dolly Bantry was in her garden clipping roses. "Jane," Dolly said, waving her in. "You're sleuthing again, aren't you?" Miss Marple laughed, sitting on a bench. "A small puzzle, Dolly. I found a note about a watcher and a box. Grayson's second will mention someone with the initial M. Does that ring a bell?" Dolly's eyes widened. "M? Well, there's Margaret Carter. Mrs. Carter, you know. She was close to Elizabeth years ago. And the colonel mentioned an old friend of Grayson's, Michael Trent, who left the village after the scandal with Edwin Morris." Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Margaret Carter or Michael Trent? Any sign of a stranger lately? "No, but Mrs. Carter's been jumpy," Dolly said. "Saw her by the church lane last night looking nervous." Miss Marple thanked her and headed to Mrs. Carter's shop, the bell jingling as she entered. Mrs. Carter was pale, her hands fidgeting. "Miss Marple," she said. "What's it today?" "A question," Miss Marple said. "You were friends with Elizabeth Langley. Did she ever mention a box or someone named Michael Trent?" Carter's face went white and her hands froze. "Michael? He was a friend, but he left years ago. Why?" Miss Marple held up the ring with E and M. "This was by the churchyard, with Elizabeth's initial. Was Michael the M?" Mrs. Carter sank into a chair, her voice trembling. "Michael loved Elizabeth, they were engaged, but Edwin's debt ruined everything. Michael left, ashamed. I wrote that note, Miss Marple. I found the box in Grayson's house when I helped clear it after the murder. I was afraid. Michael's back, and I thought he might want revenge for what Grayson knew." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Where's Michael now?" Mrs. Carter whispered. "He's staying at the Blue Boar under a false name. Please don't tell anyone. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. She visited the Blue Boar Inn, where Mr. Wells confirmed. A quiet man, Mr. Turner, had arrived recently. That night she told Inspector Slack, who found Michael Trent hiding in the inn, clutching a letter from Elizabeth begging him to return. Trent confessed to watching the church, hoping to find Grayson's box, but swore he hadn't killed him. He'd arrived after the murder. The second will, naming Clara, was Grayson's way to honor Elizabeth, and Trent had no claim. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles clicking, adding the note, wool, diary, will, and Trent's story to her notebook. The whispers in the lane had led to Michael, a man haunted by love and loss, not a killer. St. Mary Mead was safe, but Miss Marple's eyes stayed sharp, ready for the next secret to stir. Chapter 15. The Hidden Ledger. The 15th day after Mr. Grayson's murder draped St. Mary Mead in a soft golden glow, the kind of autumn morning that promised warmth but carried a whisper of winter's approach. The sun climbed over the thatched cottages, casting long shadows across the cobblestone lanes and sparkling on the duck pond, where ripples danced like scattered jewels. The air was crisp, scented with fallen leaves and the faint sweetness of apples from nearby orchards. Miss Jane Marple sat at her cottage window, her tea steaming in a delicate cup, her knitting resting beside a small notebook on the table. Her sharp blue eyes watched Mr. Hodges pedal by with his mailbag, but her mind was busy, untangling the intricate threads of the mystery that had gripped the village. The stranger in the hat, Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions, Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the button, the cufflink with an R, the torn letter, the missing letter from the manor, the scrap of fabric, the coin with an R, the church key, the ledger's note about a $50 discrepancy and a suspect T, the ledger's mention of a meeting with R, the handkerchief with an R, the silver pen, the smudged notebook, the cigarette stub with an R, the old letters, the draft will, the faded photo, the ring with an R, the locket with an E, the ring with E and M, the cryptic note about a watcher, and the gray wool thread. Mr. Baxter's confession had solved the murder, Edwin Morris's arrest had resolved an old debt, and Michael Trent's return had closed a chapter of love and loss tied to Elizabeth Langley. Yet Miss Marple felt a faint unease, like a melody with a missing note. Yesterday's revelation about Trent had answered one question, but today she sensed a new secret would emerge, a hidden truth that might reshape the story of Grayson's death. The village was settling, but the scars of the murder lingered. Mr. Baxter's arrest had restored calm, and the church hall meeting where Miss Marple exposed him was now a village tale. Mrs. Carter spun it with drama, Mr. Thomas grumbled about meddling, and Dolly Bantry called it genius. Clara and Robert Langley were still at the vicarage, Robert readying to leave for London, his debts lighter thanks to Clara's inheritance from Grayson's second will. Michael Trent, cleared of any crime, had left quietly, his heart heavy with memories of Elizabeth. The locket, ring, and note had tied up loose ends, but Miss Marple couldn't shake a nagging thought. Baxter's motive, greed and fear of exposure for skimming church funds, felt incomplete. His whispered deal with Robert about a share and the second will's mention of an M suggested a broader web. Had Baxter acted alone, or was there another hand in the shadows? A knock at the door broke her thoughts. She opened it to find Tommy, the baker's son, his freckled face alight with discovery. "Miss Marple," he said, holding out a small, leather-bound book. "I found this in Mr. Grayson's garden under some leaves by the hedge. It's got numbers and names like a list." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her smile was calm. "You're a wonder, Tommy. May I see it?" The book was worn, its pages yellowed, with entries in Grayson's neat hand, dates, amounts, and initials. T, $20 repaid. C, 15 pending. M, 100 disputed. One entry stood out. B and M, joint venture, $500, hidden. Her mind raced. A second ledger, separate from the church's, hinting at secret dealings. "Where exactly was this, Tommy?" By the hedge, near the gate, he said. It was buried a bit like someone hid it. She thanked him, slipping him a penny, and tucked the ledger into her purse beside the locket, ring, and note. The ledger was a new clue, a whisper of Grayson's private dealings that might explain his murder. B and M. Baxter and someone. With an M. She pulled on her coat and a neat hat with a small flower, her walking stick ready. Her plan was to start at Grayson's house, where the ledger was found, then visit Clara to ask about her uncle's finances. The village was awake, but a new mystery was stirring. The high street was bustling, though the chatter held a cautious edge. Mrs. Carter waved from her shop, and children ran by the pond, but eyes still flicked nervously, as if the village sensed trouble wasn't gone. Miss Marple headed to Grayson's cottage, its windows dark since his death. The garden was overgrown, the hedge thick with leaves. She found the spot Tommy described, disturbed earth by the gate, with a faint footprint, small and narrow, unlike Baxter's heavy boots. She knelt, spotting a tiny metal clasp like one from a purse, half buried in the dirt. Her pulse quickened. She tucked it into her purse, her mind buzzing. The ledger, the footprint, the clasp. Someone had been here recently, hiding or seeking. She headed to the vicarage, where the garden glowed with late blooms. Mrs. Bell answered the door, her face warm but tired. "Jane, come in," she said. "Clara's in the kitchen and Robert's packing." Miss Marple stepped inside, the air rich with the scent of baking bread. Clara was kneading dough, her face brighter, while Robert sorted clothes, his suitcase open. "Miss Marple," Clara said, smiling, "you're always welcome. What's new?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, her voice gentle. "I found a ledger in your uncle's garden, Clara, with private accounts. Did he ever mention money dealings with anyone, perhaps someone with the initial M?" Clara's hands paused, and she glanced at Robert. "A ledger? Uncle was careful with money, but he didn't tell us much. He did say once that he was fixing old mistakes, something about Mother's friends." Robert frowned, setting down a shirt. "I remember him talking about a deal gone wrong years ago. Said someone named Margaret owed him, but he wouldn't say more." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Margaret, as in Mrs. Carter. Did he keep these dealings in a special book, separate from the church? Mrs. Bell spoke up, her voice soft. "He had a small book he kept locked away. Said it was personal, not for the church. I thought the police took it." Miss Marple nodded, watching their faces. "This one was hidden. It mentions B&M, joint venture. Any idea who M might be?" Clara shook her head, but her eyes were nervous. "Maybe Margaret Carter? She was Mother's friend." Miss Marple filed the detail away. "Thank you, Clara. If you find anything else, let me know." She left the vicarage, her mind racing. The ledger pointed to Mrs. Carter, and the clasp might be hers. She headed to Mrs. Carter's shop, the bell jingling as she entered. Mrs. Carter was behind the counter, her face pale, her purse missing a clasp. "Good morning, Margaret," Miss Marple said, her tone kind. "I found a ledger of Grayson's, mentioning a joint venture with you and Baxter. Did you have business with him?" Mrs. Carter's hands froze and her eyes widened. "A ledger? I lent Grayson money years ago for a church project. Baxter was part of it, but it fell through, that's all." Her voice was shaky, and she clutched her purse. Miss Marple nodded, holding up the clasp. "This was by Grayson's garden." "Is it yours?" Mrs. Carter's face went white. I was there last week looking for Clara. It must have fallen off." Her hands trembled and she looked away. Miss Marple didn't push, but her mind sharpened. Mrs. Carter was hiding something. She headed to the manor house where Dolly Bantry was in her parlor reading a newspaper. "Jane," Dolly said, waving her in, "you're sleuthing again, aren't you?" Miss Marple laughed, sitting down. "A small matter, Dolly. Grayson had a second ledger, mentioning a deal with Baxter and an M. Margaret Carter, perhaps? Did Grayson ever talk about her?" Dolly's eyes lit up. "Margaret? Oh yes. She and Grayson were thick as thieves years ago, raising money for the church." The colonel said they had a falling out, something about a loan. Could that be your Miss Marple's heart skipped. Perhaps. Any sign of anyone poking around Grayson's house? The colonel saw Mrs. Carter there a few nights ago, Dolly said. Said she looked sneaky. Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the Blue, Bore Inn, where Mr. Wells was wiping glasses. She asked about Mrs. Carter's visits to Grayson, and he nodded. She was always arguing with him about money, said he owed her for some old deal. Miss Marple's mind buzzed. She visited Mr. Thomas's butcher shop last, where he was chopping meat, his face red. Miss Marple, he grunted. What now? A question, she said. Did Grayson ever mention a deal with Mrs. Carter and Baxter? Mr. Thomas's knife paused. Yeah, years ago they were supposed to fix the church roof, but the money vanished. Grayson blamed Baxter, but I heard Carter was in on it. His voice was sharp, and he slammed the knife down. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The ledger, the clasp, the footprint. Mrs. Carter was tied to a failed deal, and Grayson's second will might have threatened to expose her. That evening she invited Clara, Mrs. Bell, Dolly, and Mrs. Carter to her cottage for tea, setting a quiet trap. The parlor was cozy, the fire crackling. She poured tea, her eyes watching their faces. I found a ledger, she said, holding it up. It shows Grayson Baxter and Margaret Carter in a deal that lost money. Margaret, you were in Grayson's garden, weren't you? Mrs. Carter's cup rattled, and she stood, her voice trembling. I was looking for his records. Grayson cheated me out of my savings, and Baxter was stealing too. I didn't kill him, I swear. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. But you hid the ledger, didn't you? To keep your part quiet? Mrs. Carter sank back, tears in her eyes. Yes, but only after he was dead. I was scared. Miss Marple nodded, and Inspector Slack, waiting outside, took Mrs. Carter's statement. She'd hidden the ledger but hadn't killed Grayson. Baxter's guilt stood. The village slept, but Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles clicking, adding the ledger, clasp, and Carter's confession to her notebook. The hidden ledger had revealed one last truth, and St. Mary Mead was safe again, for now. Chapter 16. The Forgotten Promise. The 16th day after Mr. Grayson's murder bathed St. Mary Mead in a gentle autumn light, the kind that softened the edges of the village and made the thatched cottages glow like honey. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the cobblestone lanes and glinting off the duck pond, where a pair of swans drifted lazily. The air was cool, scented with wood smoke and the faint sweetness of late-blooming roses, a reminder that winter was near. Miss Jane Marple sat at her cottage window, her tea steaming in a delicate cup, her knitting resting beside a small notebook, on the table. Her sharp blue eyes watched children kick a ball on the village green, but her mind was busy, weaving through the intricate tapestry of the mystery that had gripped St. Mary Mead. The stranger in the hat. Clara's fear, Mr. Baxter's questions, Mr. Thomas's anger, the shoe mark, the button, the cufflink with an R, the torn letter, the missing letter from the manor, the scrap of fabric, the coin with an R, the church key, the ledger's note about a $50 discrepancy and a suspect T, the ledger's mention of a meeting with R, the handkerchief with an R, the silver pen, the smudged notebook, the cigarette stub with an R, the old letters, the draft will, the faded photo, the ring with an R, the locket with an E, the ring with E and M, the cryptic note about a watcher, the gray wool thread, the second ledger, and the purse clasp. Mr. Baxter's confession had solved the murder. Edwin Morris's arrest had settled an old debt. Michael Trent's return had resolved a love story, and Mrs. Carter's admission about hiding the ledger had tied up a financial secret. Yet Miss Marple felt a quiet stir, like a breeze rustling leaves after a storm. Yesterday's revelation about Mrs. Carter had closed one door, but today, she sensed, a new whisper would open another, a forgotten promise that might shed light on Grayson's final days. The village was finding its rhythm, but the echoes of the murder lingered. Mr. Baxter's arrest had brought peace, and the church hall meeting where Miss Marple exposed him was now a village legend. Mrs. Carter told it with a mix of guilt and pride. Mr. Thomas muttered about busybodies, and Dolly Bantry called it a masterpiece. Clara and Robert Langley were still at the vicarage, Robert's departure delayed by a last-minute loan to settle his debts while Clara seemed stronger, her inheritance from Grayson's second will giving her hope. Michael Trent had left for good, and Mrs. Carter was quieter, her role in the old deal a source of shame. The locket, ring, note, ledger, and clasp had all found their place, but Miss Marple couldn't shake a lingering question. Grayson's second will had aimed to right wrongs. But what wrongs? The ledger's B&M deal was part of it, but Baxter's greed alone didn't explain Grayson's urgency to change his will. Had he made a promise that someone wanted buried? A knock at the door broke her thoughts. She opened it to find Tommy, the baker's son, his freckled face beaming with excitement. "Miss Marple," he said, holding out a folded letter, its edges worn. "I found this in the church behind the organ. It's got Mr. Grayson's writing." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her smile was calm. "You're a star, Tommy. May I see it?" The letter was sealed with wax, addressed to "My dear friend" in Grayson's neat hand. She opened it carefully, reading, "I've failed you, but I'll keep my promise. The fund is safe, hidden where only you know. Forgive me." No signature, just a small drawing of a dove like one carved on the church pews. Her mind raced. A promise? A fund? Where exactly was this, Tommy? "Behind the organ, wedged in a crack," he said. It was like someone hid it there. She thanked him, slipping him a penny, and tucked the letter into her purse beside the locket, ring, and clasp. The letter was a new clue, a whisper of a promise Grayson died before fulfilling. She pulled on her coat and a simple hat with a tiny bow, her walking stick ready. Her plan was to start at the church, where the letter was found, then visit Clara, to ask about Grayson's promises. The village was stirring, but a new mystery was brewing. The high street was alive with morning bustle, though voices were hushed, as if the village sensed trouble wasn't done. Mrs. Carter waved from her shop, her smile strained, and Mr. Hodges cycled by, his mailbag full but eyes still darted warily. Miss Marple headed to the church, its stone walls warm in the sunlight. The organ loomed in the corner, its pipes gleaming. She checked behind it, finding a faint scratch on the wood, shaped like a dove, matching the letter's drawing. Her pulse quickened. Someone had marked this hiding spot. She scanned the floor, spotting a tiny bead like one from a necklace caught in a crack. She tucked it into her purse, her mind buzzing. The letter, the dove, the bead, new pieces of a puzzle. Inside, Mr. Bell was arranging hymnals, his face peaceful. "Miss Marple," he said, "you've saved us again. What brings you here?" "A small question," she said, her voice warm. "I found a letter from Grayson mentioning a promise and a fund. Did he ever speak of money set aside, perhaps for someone special?" Mr. Bell's hands paused, and his eyes flickered. A fund? He was always collecting for the church, but he did mention a private gift once for an old friend. Never said who. His voice was soft, and he looked away. Miss Marple nodded, watching him closely. Did he ever mention a place he'd hide something marked with a dove? Mr. Bell shook his head too quickly. No, but he loved the church's carvings. Said they held memories. His hands trembled, and he turned back to the hymnals. Missy, Marple didn't push. Mr. Bell's nerves were telling, and the fund was a lead. She headed to the vicarage, where the garden was bright with dew. Mrs. Bell answered the door, her face kind. "Jane, come in," she said. "Clara's in the parlor, and Robert's finishing his packing." Miss Marple stepped inside, the air warm with the scent of tea. Clara sat by the window sewing while Robert folded a coat, his suitcase nearly full. "Miss Marple," Clara said, smiling, "you're always a comfort. What's new?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, her voice gentle. "I found a letter from your uncle, Clara, about a promise and a hidden fund. Did he ever mention setting money aside, perhaps for someone with a necklace?" Clara's needle paused, and she glanced at Robert. "A fund? He said once he owed someone, from Mother's time. Something about a promise to help a family. He didn't say who. Robert nodded, his voice low. I heard him mention a dove once, said it was a sign of peace. Thought it was just talk. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Did he keep this promise in a special place, maybe marked with a dove? Mrs. Bell spoke up, her voice hesitant. He loved the church pews, said one had a dove carved by his father. I thought it was sentimental. Miss Marple's mind raced. Thank you, Clara. I'd like to check the church again. Will you come? Clara agreed, and they walked to the church, the sun high. Miss Marple found the pew with the dove carving, its seat loose. She lifted it, revealing a small locked tin, its lid etched with a dove. Clara gasped, recognizing it. That's Uncle's. They took it to the vicarage, where Clara's key from the box opened it. Inside was a bundle of cash, $200, and a note. For Lily's family, as promised. Forgive me, Sarah. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Sarah? Lily? She headed to Dolly Bantry's manor, where Dolly was in her garden, pruning. Jane, Dolly said, waving her in. Sleuthing again? Miss Marple laughed, sitting on a bench. A small puzzle, Dolly. Grayson left money for Lily's family addressed to Sarah. Any idea who they are? Dolly's eyes widened. Sarah? That's Sarah Price, the baker's wife. She was close to Elizabeth Langley, and her sister Lily died young. The colonel said Grayson felt guilty about Lily's death, something about a loan he couldn't repay. Miss Marple's heart skipped. Was Sarah at the church recently? The colonel saw her by the pews last week looking upset, Dolly said. Miss Marple thanked her and headed to the bakery, where Mrs. Price was kneading dough, her face pale. Miss Marple, she said. What's it today? A question, Miss Marple said, holding up the bead. I found this by the organ, and Grayson left money for your family addressed to you, did you know? Mrs. Price's hands froze, and she sank into a chair, tears in her eyes. Lily was my sister. Grayson promised to help after she died, but he never did. I found his letter in the church looking for answers. I didn't take the money, I didn't know it was there. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind. You're the Sarah in the note. Why hide it? Mrs. Price whispered. I was ashamed. I thought he forgot us. Miss Marple called Inspector Slack, who confirmed Mrs. Price's story. She'd searched the church but hadn't stolen anything. The money was given to her family, fulfilling Grayson's promise. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles clicking, adding the letter, bead, and Mrs. Price's story to her notebook. The forgotten promise had been kept, and St. Mary Mead was safe, but Miss Marple's eyes stayed sharp, ready for the next whisper of truth.